the spaceship.
Yeah.
Today I wanted to keep it simple.
There you go. Well, I like your background.
Thank you.
Sometimes people lean back and their heads disappear completely. It's
Yeah.
really kind of scary.
Yeah. Well, I do have 6 o'clock on my side, but and I know Rachel is coming a little bit late. And then
I'm here.
Rachel's here. Yep.
and Mary Bye is probably. Okay, perfect. Thank you. Is channel 8 ready to go? By any chance?
Yep, we're ready to go.
Okay, perfect. Then we call the meeting to order. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the September 22nd study session of the Boulder City Council. First, we have one announcement concerning the 2020 census. Boulder County is currently at 76.5% response rate, and in the city, we are at 73.8%. There is still time to respond to the 2020 census, so let's get to 100%. Completing the census is 100% safe, easy, and important. The questionnaire only takes a few minutes to complete. Your responses are secure and confidential. The result will help direct billions of dollars in federal funding to our community, including resources for emergencies and disaster responses. Please encourage your friends and family to respond by September 30th deadline at my2020census.gov or by calling 844-330-2020. Tonight we'll be covering 2 topics: the police oversight implementation update and next step, and then input from council concerning the severe weather shelter for the 2021 season. Before we do so, our council member, Rachel Friend, will read a special message on behalf of the entire council in honor of Ruth Bader Ginsburg.
Thanks, Junie. So I have been without Wi-Fi or reception for the last 5 days, so I did not receive whatever we might be reading tonight. Does anybody have something? I didn't get an updated packet, so we may have to delay until 2 weeks if it's not at anybody's disposal.
Yeah, we are going to have to delay because,
Okay.
Rachel, we were under the impression that you were preparing this, not city.
Got it. All right, we'll come back to it in 2 weeks. Thanks.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, Rachel. So does anyone has any comment about Ruth Bader Ginsburg that they would like to say or make? I believe, wait a minute, I need to check. Sam, do you have any comments? Anyone?
Well, I think that we all recognize that she was a great woman and she gave her life to public service. Many of the causes that she devoted her life to were around empowering people who were disempowered, including women and minorities. She was a champion for the voter access laws, as well as for women's right to choose whether to have an abortion or not, and putting women on equal footing with men. And so it is a great loss to all of us that she passed, and we regret that happened, and we look forward to hopefully having someone replace her on the court who shares her values.
Thank you, Sam. Rachel, I saw your hands up. Would you like to say something?
Nope.
No?
I think
Okay.
not yet.
Yeah, I just learned as well from Mark that Ruth Bader Ginsburg was his teacher. I don't know if he wants to say anything, but
Sure.
that's all.
No, I greatly appreciated having the opportunity to study under her, but I would be remiss if I didn't say she was as intimidating a professor as I ever had. And she would look down at her chart of the attendees in the class, and the scariest words I ever heard were when she would look up and say, "Mr. Wallach." And it was, but it was an honor to be in her class. And I reiterate what Sam said, she She was a great woman and a great Supreme Court justice. And if we got a replacement justice who was 2/3 of what she was, we would be doing well indeed. And I greatly mourn her passing. Thank you.
Thank you for your reflection, Mark and Sam. Now we will move on to the next step or the next part of our presentation here, and I will turn the meeting over to Jane, our city manager, to kick off the presentations.
Thank you, Councilmember Joseph. So this part of the presentation will be started by our new independent police monitor, who I know you all have met, Joey Lapari, and Joey has been working with our oversight task force. So Joey, do you want to introduce your team?
Absolutely. So good evening, everyone. Thank you all for having this on the agenda and for your ongoing interest and support for the oversight ordinance. So as Jane said, my name is Joseph Lapari. The other presenters tonight will be Todd Conklin, you see on your screen, and Michelle Dene. Both Todd and Michelle are members of the current implementation team and have been both working hard, very hard to get this across the finish line. So looks like we have a presentation. All right. So what we'll be doing tonight, we'll take you through, if you can go to the next slide. We'll just take you through sort of a reminder for you of what the goals and the purpose of this oversight mechanism are. Michelle will review with you the monitor panel hybrid that the implementation team ultimately decided on. And she'll also review with you some of the other options that were looked at. I'll take a few minutes then to update you on sort of the progress of the implementation team and give you a sense of the work that they've been doing, the very diligent, persistent work that they've been doing. And then we'll hand it over to Todd, and Todd will cover the different roles of the various entities involved in this process. And then he'll walk you through a procedural flow chart to show you how the process is going to work. Then I will come back on and take you through some of the specific revisions that we've made since the initial passage of the ordinance. Most of this was just to flesh out aspects of the ordinance that had not been fully articulated in the initial version. Then we'll wrap up with next steps and any questions that the council members may have. And so next slide. And so we'll turn it over to Michelle.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for being here tonight. There's some new faces that I'm happy to see and some rejoining faces that I'm also happy to see. So much has happened, I feel like, since we were all in the same room together. So I just want to say thank you for being here and for your time. Before I get into Slide City, I would like to remind us what brought us here and bring in a quote from Mr. Zaid Atkinson that he made at the age of 26 after his encounter with the Boulder Police Department and all the fallout that came from it. And he said, "There are instances like this where people don't come out alive. I'm blessed that I got out alive and unharmed. It definitely brings fear to my heart knowing that some people don't survive." As we've seen in all of the headlines recently, that is unfortunately entirely too true, which brings me to my second quote from Mary Frances Berry. "When you have police officers who abuse citizens, you erode public confidence in law enforcement. That makes the job of good police officers unsafe." And I just really think both of those bring in so much of the energy that brought us here and so much of what we look forward to building with this department and this community. So I will continue into my first slide. A reminder of our goals. The task force was to develop an oversight model independent from the police department to better analyze police department trends and policies, procedural improvements regarding complaint filing, investigation monitoring, and community oversight of investigation outcomes. So instead of people sitting around feeling voiceless, they feel like they are in fact heard and a part of the process. And the last piece, and one of the most important, is to enhance community outreach and engagement. Because if we all feel like we're walking on the same street, then it's not going to be the same sort of energy. Next slide, please. Here we have something that was sort of the focus of our work over the last, I feel like the last 6 months counts for 2 years, so I'm going to say 3 years. In order to build equity, you have to start with trust. And through equity, you can build transparency. In order to build transparency, you have to have a means of timeliness and things getting turned around to where people feel like there's accountability. And through accountability, you have trust, and round we go, building a stronger community. Next slide. This is a recap of the main 3 models of police oversight. We worked directly with the National Association for Oversight of Law Enforcement, otherwise known as NACOL. You might hear it referred to that further in the presentation. The 3 main models are as follows: investigation focused, which means that an outside entity is coming in and reviewing an investigation, usually after the fact, and can be costly depending on the needs of the community and has its own pros and cons that we weighed. And then there's review focused, which means that after the fact, there's a board of community members that is reviewing a case and sort of making commentary to the chief or to the public. The third is an auditor monitor focused model, which has someone independent of the police department who is sort of walking alongside the investigation, making sure everything is being done in a timely and respectful manner. And we ended up with a hybrid of the 3. Next slide, please. We've decided on a full-time independent police monitor with a community police oversight panel. So like I was saying before, the monitor is independent from the police department. That person will review and audit investigations. We like the idea of opening doors for complaints being received outside of the police department so they can be received through the monitor's office and communicated to the department accordingly. The monitor will establish direct relationships with community members, both those feeling underrepresented or disenfranchised and those who would like to better get to know their neighbors. All the members of the community panel will have voting power, and together they will make policy recommendations to further the growth of this department and this community. Next slide.
Okay.
And it's back to Joey.
Thank you, Michelle. I thought Michelle's portion of the presentation was helpful to try to sort of remind us what sort of issues and decisions have been thought through up to this point. And now I want to take a moment just to kind of pause and highlight the really difficult work that this entire implementation team has been engaged in over the past almost 2 years for some of them now. And you know, anytime you're talking about policing, you're talking about race, you're going to have just inherently difficult conversations, difficult issues to work through. And I just want to thank the entire implementation team for not only sort of bringing their own observations, their own life experiences to this process, but also want to thank the members of the police department who also engaged in this process, which is not always easy for police departments and police officers to do. So all the folks that have been involved in this process, I think, have demonstrated a commitment to not only their community, but just persistence in the pursuit of justice. And I think they should be thanked for that and really applauded for the work that they've been doing. Next slide, please. I just wanted to share a few images with all of you from this 2-year process that many of these folks have been through. I had access to an archive collection of photos that I was able to go through and really see visually, the meetings and the work that had been done before I arrived. And again, I think you can look at these pictures and sort of see both the camaraderie, but also, they were engaged in some intense discussions. There were disagreements that they had to work through. And going through the archive pictures, there were so many of these large Post-it note images that you see there in the middle. And you could literally see them thinking through the process and documenting their own thought process. And so I think that was really valuable that they went through that process. These entities are unique to each city. You can't just take one and copy it from one city and paste it into another city. You really have to go through this process to build your own oversight mechanism. And these folks did that. And I just wanted to thank them again and sort of honor the hard work that they did. And I should say, I think they had some fun along the way too. It wasn't just doom and gloom and difficulty. I think that should be mentioned as well. Next slide, please. I also just wanted to use a couple of quotes I thought that sort of, for me, encapsulated what I observed with this implementation team over time. The first one is from Helen Keller. She said, "Until the great mass of the people shall be filled with a sense of responsibility for each other's welfare, social justice can never be attained." When I came across that quote, it really struck me as, wow, that's really what this group of people did. This implementation team, they came together in the interest of other people's welfare, in the interest of their fellow community members. And I think that needs to be recognized and appreciated. Secondly, from Marianne Wright Edelman, she said, "The challenge of social justice is to evoke a sense of community that we need to make our nation a better place, just as we make it a safer place." And that quote there, I think, encapsulates the balancing act that any group that is doing a reform mechanism, creating a reform mechanism in the realm of policing has to keep in mind that, yes, we're here to make the nation, the country a better place, make our communities a better place, but we're also working for public safety here. And I think, maintaining that commitment to public safety at the same time that you're making your community better is an important balance to strike. And they've done that, I believe. Lastly, from an unknown author, I really like this quote because I think it demonstrates exactly what the overall process that this implementation team, this group of folks went through. "Reform is not an idea we implement. Rather, reform is something produced by the interactions between groups, which comes to have meaning through institutions." And that's really what we had, a diverse group of folks with different backgrounds, different professional experiences, some police, some not, some civilians. But they all came together, brought their experiences together, and built a new institution that captures the values that they shared together. And so, it shouldn't go without remark that the commitment that is required to get through this process. I've been a part of these processes in other cities and seen lots of people kind of come and go, and I just really want to thank the implementation team for the commitment that they demonstrated and how they came up with a very workable and good mechanism that is going to bring transparency and increased accountability on behalf of the public in Boulder. So with that, I will turn it over to Todd, who will take you through some of the specific roles of each entity and the flow chart. Todd?
Hello, everybody. All right, next slide, please. It's good to be with all of you tonight. I've been here several times before doing these update presentations, so I haven't had the chance to meet all of you because of the pandemic, unfortunately, but it's good to be here with you tonight. So here on this slide, we see the 4 different institutions that will all be working together in some capacity in this police reform process. So beginning at the top with the role of the monitor, obviously we have here with us tonight our monitor, Joey Lipari. He's done a great job. We have a very good relationship with him and we're very happy to have him. So, just to quickly go through the role of the monitor here, it would be to receive, classify, and route the complaints once those complaints are received. Upon receiving, classifying, and routing those complaints, He would also oversee the investigation that is being performed by the Internal Affairs Department within the Boulder Police Department. The Internal Affairs Department is that department within the Boulder Police Department that's actually doing the investigation. So the monitor would be there to oversee it, make sure everything's being done responsibly, fairly, and thoroughly. So the monitor would also be working with the community oversight panel in presenting the finalized case to them, answering any questions that they might have, and working with them and kind of helping them through that process. So that brings us to the next kind of institution that we've built in this process, which is the community oversight panel. So the community oversight panel would be reviewing completed internal affairs investigations. So the community oversight panel would have the authority to decide which cases that they would select. They are not required to select all of them, but we imagine that they realistically would, because these would be pretty serious cases, and that's what this panel is designed to do. So upon reviewing that case, they would work with a monitor. The monitor would help them work through these tough questions, answer any questions that they might have. And once they feel complete with that process, they would issue a recommendation to the chief of police regarding that case. Furthermore, they can also select policy and procedure areas to be studied by the monitor for possible areas and avenues of reform. Furthermore, they would also evaluate the office of the monitor itself in order to provide an internal accountability mechanism there, kind of keep things moving, growing, and going forward. The next and third institution that actually already existed, it predated our work, is the Office of the Professional Standards Unit. So another way to think about this office is they're essentially the internal affairs department of the Boulder Police Department. So if you hear me use the phrase internal affairs or professional standards unit, functionally that's the same thing. This is the office that is actually investigating a complaint against an officer once that complaint is filed. So the professional standards unit and the monitor are going to have a very close relationship by definition. They're going to be working together very closely. The monitor would be overseeing that investigation, offering guidance and assistance if that were to be needed. And the fourth and final institution, which also obviously predated our work, would be the chief of police. And their role in this process would be to make the final decision once that investigation has been completed. All right, next slide, please. All right, so looking at this flow chart here, I know the text is probably very small, but this is the complaint procedure. So I'm not going to read through the whole thing, but I will take you step by step through each step in this process of where the complaint would go. So if you have any questions, I would be more than happy to answer them at the end of this presentation, because I know that this can be kind of a complex process here. So the first step is that there would be a complaint. So a community member is unhappy with how something's done, or maybe it's an officer saw something that they thought need to be reported. They would file that complaint. Now there are two ways that complaint can be filed. The complaint can, number one, be filed with the monitor themselves. So that complaint can be filed via an email, a phone call. They can file it online in a Dropbox. They can walk into the monitor's office and file it. We try to keep that as expansive as possible to make everyone feel welcome enough to file a complaint, because some people might be more comfortable with an email, or some people might just want to walk in the office or give a phone call. That's why we have so many options there. The second way to file the complaint is that they can go to the Boulder Police Department themselves. Same thing there. They can do a phone call. They can go in person. However they want to do that, they can also file it with the Boulder Police Department. So the important thing here is that these two entities will communicate with each other within 24 hours once they have received a complaint. The monitor receives the complaint, they will notify the Internal Affairs Division. If the Internal Affairs Division receives the complaint, same thing. They will notify the monitor within 24 hours. So moving on to step two, once that happens, the oversight panel will be notified that a complaint has been filed, and they will be given a general description of what that complaint is. They are not going to be given regular updates regarding the investigation at this point. And the reason for that is you do not want to bias the panel against any of the parties at this stage. You don't want to inundate them with every nuanced detail of the investigation. They'll get that once it's been completed. So right now they're just going to be told, be on the lookout in the coming weeks because we have an investigation. So try to make sure your schedule is reasonably open. So moving forward to step three, once that has been done, the IA sergeant will conduct the investigation. The monitor will oversee this process, provide guidance if needed, and that's pretty much step three in that one. Not too much complicated there. Moving on to step four, the Internal Affairs Sergeant will have completed their investigation. So once the Internal Affairs Sergeant has completed that investigation, that the result and that completed investigation is then given up through the command staff of the Boulder Police Department. So it would go, to a sergeant, a commander, and a deputy chief, I believe is the process there. And the reason that they do that is because it provides an internal accountability mechanism within the Boulder Police Department and kind of creates an accountability culture there, which we believe is a very good thing. And so they would be kind of making a recommendation saying, we think this investigation has been done thoroughly, and then they would kind of push it up the chain of command that way. And so once that has all been done, it's gone up the chain of command, then we get to step 5, which is the monitor would provide recommendations regarding the investigation, kind of what they thought about the whole thing. Once that happens, the case will then be given to the oversight panel, and the oversight panel would vote on whether or not they want to accept that case. If they do accept that case, they would read through it in a confidential setting. They would discuss it among themselves. If they have any questions, they are free to ask the internal affairs sergeant and the monitor about any questions, like what's happening here? Do you think you need to look into this area a little bit more? Could you explain this to us? We're a bit confused on this area. And once they feel complete with that process, they would then make a recommendation to the chief of police and then give that case to the chief, which brings us to step 7. The chief would then read through that, read the recommendations that all these other parties have given, and they would make that final determination on the case. So the authority for final determination still rests with the chief of police. Once the chief has made that final determination, they would then inform the original complainant and the party, they would inform all the relevant parties what has happened and what the resolution is. After that, the monitor would also then talk to the complainant saying, this is my opinion of the investigation, here's what I think about it. And they also have the ability to make a public report regarding this investigation. So I know that was a lot of information. Be very happy to answer questions about that. And I'll hand it back to Joey.
Thank you, Todd. Appreciate that. You can go to the next slide, please. Okay, so now I'll take you through sort of the various categories of revisions, or really say revisions, but it really was more of a fleshing out or completion of the initial ordinance. So our first category is complaint and investigations process. We made some language clarifications to make it absolutely clear that all civilian complaints will be received, classified, and reviewed by the monitor. There's some initial language in the ordinance was only if they were indicated that the monitor would review it only if it was filed with the monitor, and that wasn't exactly the intention of the implementation team. So the monitor will be able to see any complaint, whether it's filed with the monitor or with the police department. The monitor will observe interviews and recommend additional investigation if warranted. There was some discussion around these areas. In regards to observing interviews, it was initially worded as participate in interviews, but through additional discussion, we felt that was sort of an impossible position to put the monitor in, to both to operate as an investigator and then have to come around and review the investigation. That's sort of inherently a conflict. And so we kept the monitor in the interviews, but in an observation role, not in a investigative sort of questioning role. And then around recommending additional investigation, the original ordinance said can propose additional investigation. There was some discussion around making that stronger, potentially to require additional investigation. Ultimately, where the implementation teams, what the implementation team settled on was to recommend additional investigation. But we also created a mechanism where it's not just a one-time recommendation. So the monitor will make the recommendation to the internal affairs sergeant for additional investigation. If the internal affairs sergeant rejects that recommendation, the monitor can then make the recommendation to the chief, and that is done in writing. And then the chief's response is in writing. If the chief refuses or rejects that recommendation, then the monitor can appeal to the city manager and recommend that another angle of investigation be carried out. And then the city manager would make that final determination in those cases. I don't expect that last one to be a common issue. I think that would be very rare indeed. The last portion on this slide, we've added some clarification language just to make it absolutely clear that the monitor and the panels review and recommendations occur prior to the chief of police decision, the decision made by the chief, so that they can get those recommendations in a timely way. Next slide, please. Application, selection, and removal process. We just needed to flesh out what this was going to look like, how people were going to apply to be on the panel, how they were going to be selected and potentially removed if that needed to happen. And so consistent with the city's overall commitment to racial equity, the implementation team wanted to make sure that there weren't any unnecessary barriers to people applying to become a panel member. And so the barriers are low. There are no barriers. Basically, you just have to make a phone call or send an email to indicate your interest. Once you've indicated your interest, the current implementation, the way the implementation team is proposing that this will work, is that the implementation team members, the current implementation team members who are not interested in being on the oversight panel will partner with 2 local nonprofits to select, to interview and select the panel members. And this will be a fairly intensive interview process where the panel members will be able to ask any questions they want and really get to know the person, get to know their background, their perspective. And then once that selection panel makes their selection of who they want on the oversight panel, those names will then go to the city council as proposed here, and the council will vote individually on each proposed or prospective panel member to whether to approve their appointment or not. Similarly, if the oversight panel has cause to need to remove a fellow oversight panel member, either because they violated the confidentiality agreement, which I'll talk about in just a minute, or they just failed to perform their duties. They don't show up for meetings, don't participate in the case reviews. The rest of the panel can actually vote them off the panel. If that were to occur, those removals, those votes to remove would also go before the city council, and the council would then approve or confirm that removal. I should say that once the initial oversight panel is seated, the way this ordinance is proposing would be that the existing oversight panel will partner with 2 local nonprofits, just like the implementation team does in the initial stage. But in the future, the oversight panel will work with the nonprofit to interview and select members for council's approval. Next slide, please. Regarding the terms of service, the implementation team settled on 11 panel members, 2 of which will be designated as specific student seats. And these could be any student in higher education, whether it be CU, Naropa, or any other university or college in the area. We thought it was important to ensure that we incorporated college students into this process, partly because this process was sort of kicked off because of an interaction with a college student. The challenge with that was if we had, your typical terms for panels like this would be 2 to 3 years, but that would be a challenge for students. If we had particularly a 3-year term for students, that would pretty much eliminate seniors and probably juniors from participating. We'd only get freshmen and maybe sophomores applying to this. And so we wanted to make sure we opened this up to all classes of students, and including grad students. And so we thought 1 year was reasonable for students, given their sort of inherently transitory nature, graduating, moving on. But we'll also have 2-term maximum, both for the non-student members who will have 3-year terms and the student members who will have 1-year terms. So maximum of 6 years for non-students and 2 years for students. Next slide, please. We also needed to create a process where the oversight panel could hear reviews of cases and the details of cases in confidence, in a confidential setting. The reason for this is fairly obvious, but in these cases, you often have privacy concerns. You have juveniles who may be a part of these cases, and so you have to have a sort of protected, confidential setting to openly discuss these. And so we created two different meetings. We had initially the ordinance just had a public meeting and directed the monitor to sort of discuss all the details of the cases in public. That we decided just wasn't workable. It wasn't in anyone's interest. And so we'll have public meetings where we report out on sort of summary information about sort of the number of cases that are under investigation, how long they've been under investigation, what types of complaints, what types of allegations it includes, to give the public some sense of what is happening in the process. But when the implementation team discusses the actual case itself, we'll go into a closed meeting to protect the complainant and the officer's confidentiality. Once the case is closed and it's completed, the board and the monitor are required by the ordinance to report out on that case, but that's after it's closed and everything is completed. As I've indicated, there will be a confidentiality agreement that wasn't a part of the initial ordinance, and this is just to protect as I said, the privacy of the complainants and to ensure the integrity of the process. Next slide, please. Lastly, the ordinance did direct the implementation team to create a mediation process. The implementation team discussed this and felt that it would be better to put that in the operations manual once the oversight panel is created. Let that oversight panel create the mediation process and then put it in their operations manual. Mediation processes can be things that kind of evolve and develop over time, and so you wouldn't want to put the specific language of that process in the ordinance. Then you'd have to go back to the ordinance every time you wanted to adjust the mediation process. And I should say this, once this is created, it will replace the existing conflict facilitation process that is within the police department currently. And so we'll create this mediation process outside of the department, but that officers and complainants can engage in when they feel it's appropriate. Next slide. I think that, yeah, that's about it in terms of any sort of revisions or changes to the initial ordinance. As you know, we have the first reading of the ordinance coming up in October, and then followed in November by the second reading and the public hearing. Next slide. And so we're at the question portion of the presentation now. We just want to open this up to the council, give all of you an opportunity to ask us any questions you have about the ordinance, about the revisions. If there are any particular modifications you all would like to see, we are happy to answer any questions you have.
Thank you very much, Joey, for this wonderful presentation. And I appreciate the fact that students are included as part of the presentation. It's very thoughtful, and thank you so much. We have several council members with questions. We'll start with Sam. I saw Aaron was next, then Mark, and then Rachel. So please go ahead, Sam.
Oh, you're still muted, Sam.
Every night once. So thank you, Joey, for the great presentation, and to the task force for all the work that you put in. This is a really remarkable piece of work. And so I look forward to discussing it after the questions are over. My first question has to do with the application process. It indicated that barriers will be low and that folks just need to indicate their interest through one of many channels. What would the process be after that? So one question I have, would additional written application materials be accepted, or will it all be based on interviews? And if it's going to be interviews, will the questions in the interviews be standardized? So you can take those one at a time, but I was just wanting more detail about how that application process might work.
Sure. I think the way the implementation team has proposed it is that there wouldn't be any sort of written application process. It would be largely interview based. And that was intentional. We discussed the idea of submitting resumes, of submitting application letters, but they did not want to, and I don't want to speak for the implementation team, folks. If you guys want to chime in, please jump in. What's that?
I would say, since you're all familiar with the process, very similar to how this task force was created. There was no formal application. It was very much a letter of interest. And in order to remove barriers, we just didn't want to say that it had to be a letter. If that's an obstacle, then we could facilitate a phone application or something to this effect to sort of open those doors for differently abled people.
Certainly.
And to add to that, Councilman Weaver, just to add to that, we intend for that oral interview section to be a very rigorous process. You know, it's going to be a very thorough process. So what I think a lot of questions that might have come up in a written interview process will come up in that oral interview process to make sure that we get to know who those applicants are on a very deep level.
Great, and I'll go to the last point. Will the interview questions be standardized? So one of the things that is the case with interviews is sometimes you've got lots of standard questions and then some answers bring up more questions. And so I was just kind of curious what the thinking was about how to be fair and equitable, because you might have an applicant who's very good on their feet and very good in an interview process, but maybe less qualified or have less lived experience than somebody who isn't quite as good in an interview process, who might interview poorly, but might have a lot of experience that would be helpful. So maybe you don't have that all fleshed out yet, but I think that would be a very important piece of how you put the oversight panel together.
Absolutely, and I don't think we haven't actually talked about what those questions are going to look like, but I think it's fair to presume that it would be there would be standardized questions to make sure that the panel ensures that they do their due diligence on key issues. But then, as you said, responses to questions can raise other questions, and so there'll have to be a little room for give and take there, and to ask questions that arise based on the person's responses and answers. But I would expect that there will be a standardized set of questions to at least get it started, to make sure that it's fair as well.
Very good, thank you all. And then my only other question is, you mentioned that nonprofit organizations will be involved in the selection process. Have they already been selected, or is that would there be a process for selecting the nonprofit organizations?
They have not been selected yet. That will involve a subsequent conversation once the ordinance is actually passed, and that's decided on. That will be the mechanism. The implementation team will have to have that return to that discussion and flesh that out a little further.
Great. And are there any thoughts at this point about what the criteria might look like? Like what are because you've specified nonprofit organizations, I was wondering what the thinking was behind that and what they might look like.
I would defer to the implementation team to
discussed having this in the ordinance and decided to stay away from that. We had used the language, had a history of serving the community and serving ideally an emphasis on serving underrepresented groups. So we didn't want to say you had to be established for 10 years or 20 years, because then one of them could have closed and another one could have opened. So we wanted to be a demonstrated history of serving, but not necessarily have it be too finite to where we were going to exclude
Okay, very good. Thank you. That's all my questions, Jeannie.
Thank you, Sam. Mark, you are next.
Okay, thank you. Thank you all for that presentation. It really was very, very good. I just have a couple of sort of technical questions. The first is, how did you get to 11 members as the proper size of the board?
Yeah, I think we started off discussing 9. I think at one point 12 was proposed, and it was really kind of going through sort of the practicalities of it. I think it's probably best to try to aim for an odd number in case you have votes. You don't want to have split votes. What were some of the other considerations? I think if it were, we talked about 9, and if 1 or 2 people can't make it that week or that month, then you're down to 6 or 7 folks. And so it just seemed like 11 was sort of the right balance. I think maybe there had been some other panels that, or some other boards that the team had looked to for in terms of the numbers. But it just seemed like after some discussion that felt right to the.
Obviously, I'm going to defer to you on that, but it seems like a very large group and perhaps a little unwieldy. And are you sending to council the exact number of candidates for the board? I mean, are we ratifying, or are we making any kind of selection? And the follow-up question to that is, if in the unlikely event that we said one candidate is manifestly inappropriate for the position, what happens then?
Right. So, and I'll take the second question first. In that instance, that individual would just not be placed on the panel, and the other members that had been proposed and approved would move forward.
But would you send to us another candidate to
Oh yeah, yeah, absolutely. Then that one would be rejected, and then the selection panel would have to meet again to identify another person to send to you.
And my last question is there any process for resolution if there are differences between the monitor and the panel?
So the monitor will communicate the monitor's recommendations to the chief separately from the panel, and so they can disagree. But I'll say this: what is going to bring all these different entities that are making these recommendations to the chief largely to consensus is the department's adoption and the chief's adoption of a disciplinary matrix, which is going to sort of lay out what these options are for various forms of discipline. And so the oversight panel will have that, I will have that, and so we'll all be sort of working from the same set of expectations.
Okay. All right, well, thank you. That was very helpful.
Thank you.
All righty, thank you very much. Aaron, you were next. I'm not sure if you still want to go ahead.
I do, yes. Thank you, Junie. And thanks very much, Joey and Todd and Michelle, for your presentations and for all of your work on this. Todd and Michelle, you've been at this a long time. Really appreciate all the effort you put into this. Very careful thought. And we're getting close to the finish line. It's great to see. So Sam and Mark asked several of my questions. One remaining one is what allows the oversight panel to meet in closed session? And this is probably a Tom Carr question. Tom, I thought that all of our public, or all the meetings in the city by public bodies had to be publicly accessible.
Not technically. So actually under the law, the only body that has to meet publicly is the council. As a policy matter, we extend that to all boards and commission. This is not a board or commission under the charter. So there really is no law or requirement that they have to comply with the Open Meetings Act. And Luis Toro is also on the call, and he's thought about this more than I am. If he has anything to add, I'd appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks. We did look at that pretty carefully. Basically, Tom already laid out the legal background. And the other concern, though, is that we're going to be discussing, or the oversight panel is going to be discussing confidential personnel matters, and that's something that we strongly believe should not be, or the panel, the group strongly believes was not appropriate for the public. They spent a lot of time balancing the desire for transparency with the need to protect, the confidential information of city employees. So that's the compromise, basically. So the way it was written is most of the proceedings will be public, but when they're discussing specific cases and naming names, that should not be public, was the determination of the panel. And Tom already laid out that the open meetings law and our city charter provision about executive sessions for council don't apply to this group.
Gotcha. Yeah, no, I totally understand the rationale for why you would want to do a closed session. So that makes sense to me. Just to understand that a little better, is it really a matter of choice that we fully apply the open meetings law to our boards and commissions, or is that not required by law?
Choice and tradition, yes, Aaron.
Okay.
The open meetings law applies only to governing bodies, and those are clearly not. But because they're advisory to council and the tradition in Boulder and the strong language in the charter that says all meetings shall be open, doesn't say that about boards and commissions, but we apply it.
Great. Well, I'm glad we do, but I had thought it was a little bit more ingrained in law than that, but I'm glad we do it. So I think that's it for my questions. I'll just have a few comments once we get to the discussion point. Thanks.
Thank you, Aaron. Next is Rachel.
Thanks, Junie. You're doing a great job following along here. I'm impressed. I'm a little stressed about that position myself. Okay, thanks to everybody for the presentation and the hard work that's gone before this for the whole oversight undertaking. I don't know who this question is to. It may be to Tom or Jane or council members who were on when we were seating the initial committee, but I'm wondering, why would council select and approve the panel? It feels a little bit like we're getting into more hiring and firing than the charter authorizes us to do. I understand we do it with boards and commissions. I'm not sure if this is in the same vein, but it feels a bit like we would be possibly micromanaging, and I have concerns about politicization when we do appointments. So I'm just wondering the history of why would we seat this with council? Why did that happen, and why would we want to do that?
Well,
Could I answer that very quickly?
The council is approving or ratifying, not necessarily appointing. And the thought was that council should have some say because you're the representatives of the people.
But it sounds like from Mark's question that if we say no, then it's a no. So it's beyond, like, we actually have the ultimate authority.
Yep.
I'm hearing correctly. No?
Yes.
Yes.
And the question is, do you want to delegate that to community members or have some council oversight? And this was a compromise, taking it out of the city manager's hand, leaving it to council to ratify.
Because we didn't want it in the city manager's office?
Or the city manager didn't want it in her office. One or the other.
So it just seems like something that we don't do day to day. It doesn't sound like we'd be doing the direct interviews or reading the applications. We would be more ratifying other people's interviews and selections. So it just seems like something that's not within our usual purview, and I'm not sure that we have the expertise to do it. To do it in just this one scenario.
In many ways, this is a hybrid. It's not a board and commission. It's not a purely community working group. It's different. They have a role in police discipline, and the thought was that there should be some community oversight, and as the representatives of the community, you provide that oversight.
All right, I appreciate the history there. I will circle back to it when we have discussion. Thanks. That's my only question to Virginie. Sure.
Do you mind if I colloquy on that? Yeah, so thank you. So Rachel, I think you raise a question for me with that question, which is, okay, so council has this final approval role, and I understand the compromise that gets you there. On what basis do we then make that decision, given that it sounds like the primary evaluation of these candidates is through interviews, right? Like, it seems like an unreasonable expectation that council will go listen to many hours of detailed interviews, right? So what would be the basis that council would evaluate those prospective appointees?
Great question. Yeah, go ahead, Michelle.
I beg everyone's pardon. I'm not sure exactly how ordering usually works, but that is something that we went back and forth on at length, and were impressed based on City Council's desire for input thus far that they want that. And if we didn't include it, it would just end up sort of the conversation we'd be having oppositely tonight if we didn't write that in.
Michelle, sorry, let me jump in. The connection was breaking up a little bit. Sorry. Aaron, I think your question was, what will the council members base their approval on if they're not in the interview, right?
Right, because I do understand how you arrived at the council having a role, but the question is how would we base our decisions?
Right. So I think there would be a written product from the selection panel. Once they've made their selections, they would provide a write-up on each of the members that they're proposing to you, so you have something to go off of. And then you would have the chance in the approval process if the council wanted to, I think, question the person. I think that could be part of the process. So I think a written document that you would receive explaining to council members why the selection panel selected that individual, gives you a description of their background, everything that you would need to know to evaluate that person. And then, yeah, the council would make their determination. I think this isn't necessarily articulated in the ordinance now, but if the council needed additional, whatever the council feels like they need to make that decision, just let us know and we can try to figure something out. Okay. But that's a fair question. So I would expect a written product and then whatever else the council would want in terms of doing their own due diligence.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, we might want to pin this down a little bit more in the ordinances, but we can discuss it a little later.
Sure.
Can I colloquy on Aaron's colloquy?
Only if I can colloquy back on it.
I just wanted to follow up. I was curious in Michelle's response. I think I heard, basically, we knew that you all would want to be the final firing authority here for this panel. If that hadn't been the case, what might the Oversight Committee have recommended? Or what would your recommendation be? Who do you think should be doing the final decision-making here? And I'm sorry if there's background noise. I'm in a hotel room with family and there's a lot of conversation. So sorry in advance for that.
I apologize for cutting out. Originally, we had discussed in its sort of infancy that it would be without that third mechanism. It would be that the current community members and the nonprofits pick the following, and then they pick, on and on down the line, the panel and the nonprofits that have agreed to sort of work on. And Todd, correct me if this is a misrepresentation, but this is my recollection, that it would be sort of more self-contained and not need that approval.
Correct. In our initial discussions, that's what we assumed. And then we also counter-assumed that council would want some say in that process. So it would be helpful for us as the implementation task force to kind of receive some guidance from council here as well.
Thanks for that clarification.
On how you all.
Thank you. Next is Mary.
Thank you, Junie. I think most of my questions have been answered. I do have one regarding the seated panel and development of the operations. Would they be the ones that would develop the operations manual for the panel? As soon as the panel gets seated, they would go to work on that?
Yeah, I think they would. What I would imagine is they would probably need to form a working group, a subcommittee that would then sort of focus more on that. And obviously, as the monitor, I would assist with that and provide whatever resources they need. I could get access to other cities' operations manuals for their boards and for their panels, and provide them the resources that they need to determine their process. So yeah, it would ultimately be shaped by the seated panel.
Okay, great. And then a question about meeting frequency. Would it be like once a month or ad hoc or more when needed or?
Yeah, so
right now it's set up so that they're going to meet minimum once a month, and they can meet more if needed.
Okay, great.
And then just add a little bit to that. There'll be I think the expectation is that there'll be a once a month public meeting, and then as cases arise and the panel needs to meet to discuss the case, then they have to meet maybe several other times during the month, depending on the case load.
Okay, great, thank you. And then on in that flow chart, Todd, that you presented, there were 2 ways of initiating the case, and is it limited to those 2 methods?
Right now, the 2 methods are you can either file a complaint with the Boulder Police Department or with the monitor, and those are the 2 methods as of now. Yes.
Okay, great. And then
Mayor, we do hope to create a multitude of avenues for people to file complaints. So be that a mail-in or maybe a text line or something. We've discussed a variety of ways for people to get the word to where it needs to go versus just having to go to the monitor or the police department. So we do intend on expanding that. Great.
Okay, did you consider the possibility of having folks come to a member of the panel?
That didn't come up since I've been here. Did that come up on the committee, on the implementation team before I was here?
I don't believe it did, but that's
I
definitely
don't
valid.
believe it did, because if it came to the panel, they would either have to route it to the monitor or the Boulder Police Department. And I think actually we did have those discussions, and then questions came up of, well, if someone, if you brought the complaint to the panel, would the panel member who received that have to recuse themselves once they received the investigation? And so I don't think we intended for the panel to be
Okay.
recipient point for a complaint.
Yeah.
All right.
Right. I think what will probably end up happening in practice, the panel, will be assisting with community outreach. It won't just be the monitor going out to do community engagement events. And so members of the panel will be coming in touch with members of the public in these sort of settings. And so you probably will have community members come to a board member or a panel member and say, hey, I have this issue. I want to talk with you about it. Do I file a complaint? Do you think I should file it? Or maybe they'll say, I already know I want to file a complaint. What is the process? And at that point, the panel member would just direct them to the process to file. They can, I would encourage the panel members not to discuss the case too much, because exactly the reason that Todd said, you may back in have to review that case. But, they would need to direct the person either to the monitor to file the complaint or to the police department to file the complaint.
Okay, thank you. Then previously, before we got going on the task force and a police oversight panel, we had independent investigations that would happen, such as what happened in the Zaid Atkinson case. What kind of role would there be for an independent investigation? Would that still happen? Is that off the table? How does that integrate into this process?
Right. So as proposed, the ordinance does not have an investigative role for the monitor, precisely because the monitor's main role in this ordinance is to conduct audits and reviews of the investigations. And so if you had, so in a sort of general sense, on a day-to-day basis, that would be putting the monitor in a compromised position to have to review the cases that they participated in as an investigator. I think in a situation, yeah, Michelle, go ahead.
That's correct, the role of the monitor, but we did, in our last round with City Council, be sure to include sort of a clause for there to be this option for an independent investigation. So if something like what happens again, and for whatever reason, the members of the community feel that both, in this case, you and the community panel have not come to a just conclusion, they can petition City Council. City Council can decide we are going to go ahead and move forward with an independent investigation. And we as a task force have identified some of the most qualified bodies to do such an investigation. So that was left in intentionally.
Okay, okay, great, thank you. And then, let's see. The panel, so as I understood it, the monitor presents cases to the panel, and then the panel decides whether or not to take a case. Under what criteria does the panel do that?
So when the panel is formed and they kind of create their bylaws, codes of conduct book, they would establish regulations that would help them determine why they would accept a case and why they would not accept a case.
Okay, so that hasn't been fleshed out yet. It's still part of the operations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the language in the ordinance directs the panel once they're seated to do just that, to create that.
Okay, great, thank you. Sorry, there we go. In the ordinance, there was the term critical incidents was crossed out, but then later in the ordinance, it's actually referred to. So it was crossed out in the definition, but then referred to later on. Why is that?
Yeah, so that was around the issue of having the monitor called out to critical incidents. And so we kept the language. What ended up happening was there was multiple different definitions of critical incident. And we didn't want to be too specific in the ordinance to define critical incident in one way that would then either be inconsistent with another definition in the city, like within another institution within the city. And so the decision was made to, I'm sorry, just repeat the question for me one time. I just want to make sure I'm fully answering it for you.
Yeah, so I think you got to the answer.
Okay.
Because the term critical incident was
crossed out.
It was crossed out, but then it was mentioned later in the ordinance.
So the way we decided to resolve that was to keep the reference to critical incident in, but then have language that said the chief and the monitor will work together to identify the protocols and the types of incidents that the monitor will respond to. So we didn't want to tie it, become too specific, and then in the ordinance, and then realize down the road, oh, we need to add this other element. And so keeping it out of the ordinance allows the chief and the monitor to work together to figure out what incidents that should be. And we've already started those conversations, and they're completely open to it. It is a question of what is the trigger for the monitor to go out to observe a scene. Is it a call from that an ambulance responds to the scene? Is it a particular level of injury? And so we decided that we didn't want to write that level of detail into this ordinance, and trying to could just cause problems. And so we just got rid of the definition, kept the spirit of it, and the language that said that the chief and the monitor will work together to accomplish that.
So will that be accomplishing that? Will that be part of the once the panel is seated and things are going, that will be defined, or I'm not sure.
More those discussions have been more between the monitor and the chief and the department in terms of what would trigger. But I guess what that will probably we'll have that fully in place before the implementation. The oversight panel is seated, but once they're seated, if they want to expand that or define that more specifically, if they don't think we're doing it enough or they think we're doing it too much, they could give us some direction on that, theoretically.
Okay, great, thank you.
You're welcome.
And then I think I have one more question. So what part of the mission of the panel will be to monitor trends and new things, statistics and things that are coming down the pike, and basically it's for continuous improvement of the whole justice area of the city. So how will those materials be identified?
I'm sorry, what materials?
Materials for review and what statistics? I mean, is it going to be any member of the panel can be reviewing journals and bring it up, or is it just kind of wide open as to what can be brought to the discussion?
So I think there'll be, the way it'll work in practice, the panel will begin to review individual cases, and then they may start seeing patterns in the cases. They may start see an issue that just keeps coming up in multiple cases. And then they can sort of flag that for the monitor and say, hey, we've been seeing this particular allegation in a number of different complaints. Can you pull the data for us on how many complaints we've had like that? What's been the outcomes of them? And so then I would pull all that data put it into a package for them, present it to them, and then they would determine what they wanted to do with that. If they wanted to do further investigation or further auditing or make some recommendations to the department to address those issues.
So the trends and statistics will be related to cases that have happened, not so much as what's going on out there in the world.
It can
Not
be
necessarily.
It could be the panel could kind of identify areas within the department itself and say, we find this interesting. We think this is an area where we can, push a reform agenda, and then working with the monitor and then working with the police chief, they can start that process. So it can be the monitor doing that, and it can also be the panel doing that as well.
Okay, great. And could it also be, we're in the process of police reform, and so is that something that could be looked at as well? Could the chief, for example, say, there's this area that it would be great to get your feedback on? Is that something that could happen?
Absolutely, yes.
Absolutely, that would be like an ideal outcome if we get to that point where the chief is coming to the panel and saying, hey, I want your input on this.
Okay, great. And I think that's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. The next person is Sam, or council member.
Thank you, Judy. I was going to colloquy on Rachel and Aaron's conversation, but it was getting confusing. So this is kind of returning to the appointment question. How will the public have a chance to weigh in? So there's two parts to that. Will the interviews that the panel holds with applicants be public? And will the public be allowed to have comment there? The second part of the question is, in the way that it's been presented, where council would do the final ratification, was it intended that there would be a public hearing before the council moved on to discuss?
The implementation team has not set it up as a hearing, but now that the team has presented this to the council, the ball's sort of in the council's court to either accept or to add to that process. Sorry, your first question was?
Is the intention of the interviews, so when we do board and commission interviews, that's done in public. So the question is, was the intention of the interviews for panel applicants to be a public process so that the public could watch the interviews?
That has not been discussed since I've been here, but I'll defer to the team. I don't think that has been considered. Todd or Michelle, is there anything to add on that?
It has not been considered to this point, but we would be very happy to consider that at our next scheduled meeting.
Yeah, the reason I bring it up is in the context of just imagine a scenario in which one of the potential appointees is very controversial. And so where would it be that there would be that public input that would identify that as a controversial potential appointment? So if it were going to come to the council for ratification, I would imagine that we would do it as a public hearing in the sense that we would open it up for any kind of input or comments. If we don't have that role, but the public still wanted to have comments, so part of what Rachel was hinting at was maybe the council would over politicize it and shouldn't be involved. But it would seem like we want some route for public input on the final selected candidates, just in case there's a controversy or some kind of deep concern that wasn't fleshed out in the interview process. So I was just raising where in this process would the public enter, whether or not council approves, where is the public going to get a say, at least at the level of the ones that are being recommended for approval. And if council isn't involved, then there's got to be a step where you've got a list of people who are intended to be approved, and the public needs to be able to weigh in to somebody.
Right. Yeah, go ahead, Michelle.
Councilman Weaver, I think that's an excellent question. And we had not quite got to that level of alternative because we assumed based on a lot of, we had heard that council was going to want that piece. So we really hadn't fleshed out what the alternative would look like. But if that's something you would like us to do, we can definitely do that and bring it back for further consideration.
Great, thank you. That's all, Judy.
Thank you, Sam. Next is Rachel.
Yeah, I just had one follow-up question for Michelle. I sat here sort of reflecting on sort of the recommendation and including what you all thought council was going to really want to do with the seating process. And I'm just wondering, was there anything else that is in the recommendation or proposed ordinance that is maybe not as the committee wanted or was sort of pre-screened because you figured council was going to want it? Is there anything else that you're not, Todd or Michelle or Joey, if this applies to you as well, that you would wish were different, but it's presented to us because of maybe what we asked for a year ago? I just wanted to open it up and see if there's anything else like that. Thanks.
I actually have thank you for that question. It's very helpful. I have a question for council based off of that. I know that in previous update hearings that we've given, council expressed a desire for there to be some type of restorative justice program to be included in the ordinance. Is that something that council is still interested in?
Rachel, go ahead, Richie. Is that your only question or you have more?
Well, I did. The restorative justice pieces, I don't think to me, but that's my only question. Just broadly wanted to invite Todd or Michelle to let us know if there was anything else that they would maybe tweak before we have our discussions. And I don't know the answer to the restorative justice. I personally am a fan of restorative justice. I don't know what the conversation was though that teed that up before I was on council. I would defer to others.
And beyond that, I don't think there was anything else that the task force thought that council wanted. So we kind of structured the decision around that. That was all.
Did the task force not want restorative justice woven in?
That would be a misimpression. We were not against it. He's circling back on a question that came up previously that we had not had time to really incorporate, nor did we choose to put it into the sort of legislative piece. We would like that. That's definitely an option for the community panel to engage in. And then to echo Todd, I feel like that was really the only piece that we had sort of written for council, so to speak. The rest of it, I think we were pretty firm and pointed on what our desires were there.
Awesome, thank you.
Thank you, Rachel. Oh, there's Mary. Go ahead, Mary.
Yeah, I just have one more question. With respect to the restorative justice, we can make that part of our discussion. But one more question is for Todd and Michelle. Did the task force discuss a name for the panel other than police oversight panel?
I believe now the name is community oversight panel.
Okay.
But beyond that, I think that was kind of the consensus that we arrived at that we were comfortable with.
Okay, great, thank you. That's all I have.
Okay, great, thank you. I wanted to weigh in before I summarize some of the points or questions or concerns that you have. I spoke with Sam earlier today about the concern from the NAACP about the ordinance, and I wonder if Sam wanted to make the comment about whether the monitor should be part of the selection process or even the removal process of the panelists.
Well, Junie, I would say that was your idea, which I agree with. I think to have independence of the selection process, I think probably the monitor should not be part of selecting the members of the oversight panel, because part of their job, of course, will be to report on the performance of the monitor themselves. So I thought you made a great suggestion and I agreed with it. So if you'd like to speak more about it, I think that'd be great.
Okay, thank you. So that's up for discussion with council, I suppose, is that I had a conversation with Joey, or monitor, after I read the review submitted by the NAACP. And after our lengthy discussion, he mentioned that he's eager to take on the role, but at the same time, he understands that as the monitor, it is not necessary that he's involved in the selection and appointment process. And I mentioned, would council be interested in adding that part in the ordinance, explicitly saying that, the monitor would not be part of the selection and appointing process for the oversight panel, just so that we keep, because I think part of the issue or the concern that was brought forward by the NAACP is that there might be some conflict of interest, which I don't believe might be there, but at the same time, to keep the public, to keep the idea of transparency, just having it there in the ordinance would just solve that for the future as well. So.
Absolutely. I would just add that this question came up in our discussions in the implementation team's discussions. And I think at one point, an implementation team member either presumed or sort of suggested that I was going to be on the selection panel. And I actually said, no, I should not be on the selection panel, because that group of folks will be evaluating me as the monitor. And so this would be sort of codifying sort of something we've already identified and agreed to. So I would have zero problem with that. And I think it would be actually good, because it would protect me from any such allegations if we ever found ourselves in such a situation.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So from the discussion, here's what I heard from our fellow council members and our mayor is take into account the standardized questions for interviews to ensure equity. And also, our council member Rachel mentioned the concern about the politicization of the oversight, firing and hiring, and we should be careful not to micromanage. And also Aaron mentioned he worried about evaluation of final selection. So I think Sam also talked about that as well. He mentioned access to the public and public input is very important. So that's a gap in this presentation that we definitely have to make sure that we try to bridge. And Mary as well mentioned having complaint come through the panel members. And I thought that was a great idea, because I've worked for the UN before, and when we talk about human rights, every person who works in the UN is their job. They have a responsibility to protect and promote human rights. So when Mary mentioned the idea of having panel members accessible, or just letting them know that, yeah, their role as well is to protect and ensure safety of everyone in the community, so that they are somehow a vessel. And I thought that was great. And Rachel mentioned the restorative justice piece. That's a discussion I think we definitely need to continue. And that's about it, unless there's another question that I didn't cover and someone felt that I should have. Go ahead, Aaron.
Well, Junie, thanks for that summary. Just to clarify, I was just asking questions. I wasn't trying to bring up points yet. I was waiting for the discussion phase to do that. So I got a few other things to say when we get there.
Perfect. Thank you, Aaron. Then we should move on to discussion, unless there is something else staff or someone else thought I should have mentioned and didn't. Your hand is still up, Aaron. Is that you?
That was the comment I just made.
Okay. Who's will be the first commenter?
Or I could just start here.
Please.
Okay. Well, those were really excellent questions. And I think you all have done a phenomenal job in putting all this together. I think the original ordinance that we passed last year was absolutely on the right track. And I think the additional revisions and refinements that you've made are generally also really on the right track as well. So I'm supportive of the direction that we're going for sure. And I think my kind of fundamental additional point I would make is that I think it's fine for there to be a fair amount still to clarify after the ordinance is passed, kind of in the writing of rules and procedures and things like that. But I do think we need a little bit more written in at this stage to kind of help make sure that we're codifying kind of the direction that we're moving in. And I'll mention a few areas where I felt like it would be helpful, not necessarily to pin down exactly how it's going to work, but at least to provide some direction that we would be going in. And I'll just list these. One of them is how the nonprofits get chosen. I think having some intention around that at this stage would be important, because that could become an area of real attention, or if it's working great or if it's not working perfectly. I think people will focus in on how that's done. I think having, I read the NAACP's letter with interest, and personally, I feel like having Joey have this participatory role in the creation of the ordinance has been fine. Seems like a man of real integrity, and the panel seems to be able to operate independently. But I did feel like the point that Junie raised was a good one about writing in explicitly that the monitor would not have a role in the appointment of the panelists would be good. And also maybe to add a little bit of additional information about what the panel's review of the monitor might look like. Because I think right now, maybe I missed some detail, but right now I feel like it just states that will happen, and maybe a little bit more information about what that might look like, or some minimum standards about what that review might look like. I thought Sam's points about the interviews being public, having a public role with the selection process is important. I'm personally fine with council having a role in the approval of the members. I think the public needs to have a role, basically. And so we function somewhat as the public's representatives because we're their elected representatives. And then we take public input and channel that. So I think that's useful. If the will of council was to not have us have a final approval role, I think it would be really important to incorporate public feedback in other ways. And then I'll just throw out one, if people feel like we shouldn't just approve it, one option would be that we could have a call-up option for the appointments rather than a line item approval. So that's just, I'm not saying that's the best way to do it. I'll just throw that out there as one thing to think about. If we are doing the approval, if we are having an approval role, I think calling out a little bit more particularly what happens if council does not approve someone would be important. I think Mark asked that question. I think that was an important one to at least mention how that would work, as well as a little bit about how the panel would report out to council why they were recommending those particular people for approval. So there, I just talked for a long time, but just some ideas about how to maybe get a little bit more specificity in there. And then maybe there's some additional catch-all statement about what the next steps would be for when the panel is formed, how it would write out its rules and procedures, and who would approve those and how they'd be modified. Just because there's a lot of details that'll get created as this process moves forward, and having something in there about how that happens, I think could be helpful. All right, I'll quit talking. Thank you. Thanks for all your great work.
Thank you, Aaron. Our next speaker is Mary.
Thank you, Junie. So I agree with all of the points that Aaron brought up. And one of the things I just wanted to point to is in terms of the documentation that accompanies the recommendation from the panel for panel members. It was during the task force selection, we had a matrix that accompanied each person because there were certain criteria for the potential members, and then and whether or not each member met these criteria. So there was a matrix that accompanied the information. So that might be a helpful thing to include in the package that comes to council prior to ratification. And then I think as far as a member of the panel being able to accept a complaint I do recognize that it's important to not know too much about the case ahead of time. So if a community member were to come to a panel member because they felt more comfortable coming to a panel member rather than to the monitor or to the police, that the recommendation be that it has to be given to them in a closed envelope that the panel member can then hand over to the monitor or to the police. If the person chooses to, they could also present it in some sort of a recording. In other words, make it so that the panel members can accept complaints, but maintain their impartiality in the process of that acceptance. So whatever you need to do to make it so that the panel member does not have to recuse themselves, I think that would be a good route for a community member to submit a complaint. I think it's okay on the critical incident to go ahead and flesh that out and perhaps include it in the operations manual, but I think it will be important to pin that down because it can't be varying from case to case. So it will need to get pinned down. So I think that's a real important piece. As an alternative for the selection of the panel, one suggestion for consideration might be to include 2 council members. That was done with the selection of the task force. I'm just throwing that out there as a potential consideration. I do think that it is important for the council to have the final say, as Aaron said. We're the elected officials and we need to be the ones that have the final say in terms of we're the representatives of the community. So,
Mary, may I clarify that?
Yes, please.
So this is coupled with the sort of intersection packet you were referencing before, is that? So like submit these sort of letters of intersectionality to 2 council members as opposed to some sort of public hearing or public interview?
No, I'm sorry. Yeah, no, I was thinking to be part of the selection committee, just as it was for the task force. And
okay.
And then there would be, just as it was for the task force, there would be 2 council members who participated in the process. So I'm not saying that's how it should be done. I'm just saying that's an alternative so that when it comes to council, there is 1 or 2 council members that have been through the actual process. Just a thought. The restorative justice piece, I think that can also be part of the operations manual, but that's, I think, an important option for outcomes of this panel. So I'll leave it up to you guys to incorporate it later. And then finally, I like that you have changed the name of the panel to the Community Oversight Panel. I do have the term oversight sort of, I find a little bit troublesome, and here's why. I have been reading some history of policing in our country, and it has its roots in slave patrols, as probably many of you know, and how the police was basically lording over slaves. And so a lot of that kind of history has carried forth into our current situation. I won't go into all the details about this, but I do think that the idea of a group, to me, oversight conjures up images of people lording over other people. And I find that a little troublesome. And the role of this panel is more than just oversight. It is a role that will bring about continuous improvement of the police department and our justice system to always be improving it. And it's more than just the oversight as mentioned in the title right now. So I came up with a name, but it's just a suggestion, and you all can discuss it. You all, the committee, can discuss it further amongst yourselves. But the title that I came up for it was Community Panel for Justice in Policing, and eliminating the term oversight. Again, that is a suggestion. Just thinking about the role of this panel, which is more than just oversight. It is doing outreach to the community. It is working with the police. It's about collaboration. And that's all I have.
Thank you, Mary. I received a request from one of the task force members before we go to the next speaker. She's wondering if it would be possible kindly for the other council members who are quiet or who haven't raised their hands to just make a comment and let them know what you were thinking and whether they're going in the right direction. So they just want a little bit of encouragement. Thank you. So our next speaker is Mark.
I think they're going in the right direction. We're just making some comments. I want to thank Aaron. I think he nailed almost every possible issue on this, and it was very complete, and I agree with him on everything he said. I would hope that the panel, the board, you may have already done this, but I assume you will formulate some conflicts standards for yourselves in terms of when it's appropriate for a panel member to recuse himself from consideration. I would urge you to undertake the restorative justice task. I think that there's a great contribution to be made there. And lastly, I would also support continued council approval. We are the ultimate legislative body in town, and we are the representatives of the people. And I would not want to treat this entity differently than we treat all others where we do have some approval rights. I don't think anybody's going to have much taste for micromanaging, but ultimate approval is a little different, and I think that's something that's important for us to maintain. And that's it.
Thank you, Mark. Our next speaker is Rachel.
Thanks, Junie. Yeah, Aaron and Mary covered most of what I would have thought important, but I do want to circle back to selecting the panelists and how it's so important that we get this right. And I think what I'm hearing is that everybody understands that we are the ultimate elected decision makers for the city, and so therefore should have oversight. But there are so many important positions that we do not exercise input or screening for positions. So I don't understand why we would be doing it here when it's pretty different than the boards and commissions where people send in an application and we ask everybody questions. This is going to be pre-screened, and it just seems like it only leaves room for politicization. So if somebody is maybe not liked by the majority of council because they've been, I don't know, upsetting on a different issue, but they'd be really great on this, they could still be knocked out. And I don't think that's in the community's interest. So I don't see for that reason why we would want to get down into the weeds on this particular hiring and seating of the panel. So I'll just be on the record. I don't think it makes a lot of sense for us in terms of pitfalls. And also, I don't think we really need the extra work. And to do this right, I think we should be having the interviews. And if we really think that we're the best people to make the decision on who to seat on this panel or who to fire from the panel, then we should be in the weeds and we should be doing it well. And if we don't want to invest the time, then I think we should trust the experts to do it and not put a rubber stamp on it. Anything, if we're saying it's not a rubber stamp, then we're doing it. If we're saying we're not doing it, it's a rubber stamp. And I think either of those scenarios makes no sense to me. That's all I got. Thanks.
Thank you, Rachel. And our next speaker is Sam.
Great. Well, I want to thank the implementation panel again. This has been really great work. A lot of food for thought here. It's a very complex topic. And so thank you for all of your hard work. I want to address the issue head on that Rachel brought up, and there's 2 points I want to make. Politicization is one thing, but public input is another thing. And so I feel like not only are we the ultimate approval body, but the pre-screening is going to give the rationale for why the panel itself thinks that, that these applicants should be the ones who are appointed. So I believe that we need to keep faith with the public and let the public have input. An example would be that there's somebody who has made it through the screening process, but unbeknownst to the panel recommending, there's a lot of objection to among a certain segment of the community. And if we have a public hearing before we ratify, I doubt we would discuss each person on the list, but if we have a public hearing, that would be the opportunity for the public to express their concern. I kind of like Mary's idea of having council members on the selection group, because that would potentially flag those things early. Maybe not, but could be. But I really, really do think that council needs to do the final approval in order to give the public a route to have input. We won't be doing interviews, and we'll be probably 99% of the time trusting the recommendation of the panel, but there could be times that would arise where we would want to step in and maybe, yes, knock one out, but ask the panel to consider the reasons that the public was upset with one or another of the potential appointees. So on that, I will weigh in that I think council does need to do a final approval. I kind of like Mary's idea, so I'd love to hear what the implementation panel thinks about the possibility. I'm not wed to that one way or the other, but sometimes council members can see something coming just because of what they've heard in the community. I want to return to something and just flag this to the implementation panel members. 11 members can really be unwieldy. 9 members can be unwieldy. So I've served on boards with 7 and 9 in the past, and 5. I think 5 is too small, typically. I think 7 is about right, and I think 9 can be too many. So if the intention is for more breadth, I can certainly see an argument for 9, but I will just put out there that in practice, 11 can be difficult to manage and difficult to give everyone time to express their opinion. I too support the restorative justice piece. So Todd, to your question, I think that's a really important component of this. I don't know that it needs to be in the ordinance, but I think it is a really, having a restorative justice component for discipline, I think could be really useful. And then I agreed with everything Aaron said. We need to figure out how the nonprofits are selected. I agree with Junie that the monitor should not be part of the appointment process. I agree with Mary about the name of the committee. I would suggest a slightly shorter name, but this would be for the implementation team to come up with. Community Panel for Just Policing eliminates a word and shortens one. But I do agree with Mary's idea about how to focus it. And if the panel decides to recommend that council not be the final approval body, which I don't think would be the right thing, but if that is a recommendation, there I think has to be a route for the public to have input. And so I imagine that the interviews would be private, the decision would be made, there'd be a recommendation passed on to council, and then it would only be if the public had a problem with one of the members that we would even take it up to talk about it. But an alternative would be that all the interviews are public. And so I think that's a meaty subject for the panel to take up. So that's all I've got, but thank you all again for your great work.
Thank you, Sam. Our next speaker is Bob.
Thanks. I also want to thank the implementation committee and Joey for putting together a very nice product and making our lives very easy. You guys are making us look good here, so I appreciate that very much. I'll just weigh in on a couple of things that have already been mentioned. With respect to the panel appointment, I agree with Sam and some other people that I do think the buck stops with council, and we are the people who are elected by the community. and who have to be ultimately responsible and held accountable for these things. I believe that virtually every resident committee or panel that we have is either appointed by council or in a few instances is appointed by the city manager at council's direction. I'm not aware of a residence committee or panel that we've delegated that authority to outside of the city infrastructure. So I do believe that should be ultimately council selection. I do agree with the observation that in most instances, council will adopt the recommendations of the of whatever nonprofits are making them. I do like Mary's idea if council members are willing to serve on the committee so that there can be conveyed to their council colleagues input from the interviews. That's a heavy lift. If two people want to volunteer for that, that's great. This is not an alternative, but it's maybe a supplement to Mary's suggestion. I think it would be helpful if there's a group of candidates that are forwarded to council for ratification. It might be helpful to have a couple of alternates as well, because it would be awkward if only 11 candidates come forward for 11 positions and council, for whatever reason, determines not to appoint one or two of them. Then we have to send it back, and other alternates have to be identified. So if alternates can be identified in the first instance, that probably avoids that toing and froing. I do agree with Sam's comment that 11 seems like a really big number. I don't feel strongly about that. If the implementation group feels that 11 is the right number and that's what's necessary for a broad and diverse perspective, that's fine. But I think 7 or 9 is probably quite a bit more manageable. And then finally, I do agree with Mary's observation that oversight is not a great word to use in the title. I do like Mary's title. Sam's amendment is fine as well. So I think something along using the words justice and community and policing and some sort of combination without the word oversight would be good. Thanks.
Thank you, Bob. And our final speaker is Adam.
Thank you, Junie. I really appreciated. This is one of those things I know less about since I wasn't involved in the process as long as my other council members, so I let them take most of the lead here. I really do like the direction that we've been going, and I'll try to just speak to the sort of crux issues. I also agree that the final approval should probably land on council, but I really liked Aaron's idea of it being call-up based. I've noticed call-ups only tend to happen when there's really, really deep community interest prior to the call-up happening. So that would indicate that if someone was being called up, there was a really strong sentiment for some reason that person should be reviewed further. And if we're trying to find something to make everybody happy, maybe we could talk about the number of votes it would take to turn someone down, get into that. So maybe it's not, you get to the number of votes where it's not exactly possible to be political. That may be something to look at. I also agreed with maybe a change to the name if the committee is open to that. And the 11 board members, I would say too, having served on 2 different boards, just for the sanity of the committee members themselves and the length of the meetings, really, really try to dig into what you're going to get out of an additional 2 members that you might not get out of 9, simply because, if you can still take that amount of time, that's totally fair. And it's an important issue to take time on, but meetings really do end up going a lot longer than you think they do. So those are the bulk of my things that I'd like to weigh in on. And I really do appreciate the work. It's really awesome to see this happening in our city. And it was more than a long time coming. So it's cool to see it finally happen.
All right. Thank you for all your comments. And I feel like all of you have already given all the comments, and I don't have much to weigh in beside everything that's been said. Aaron mentioned how nonprofit gets selected and the source of tension. That's something that the team needs to look into. And also the appointing and removal of panel members, as well as something that we have to look into. Also, I think the very most important thing is Rachel's concern about the selection process. And from what I'm hearing is that there's 8 of us here. Most of us are in agreement that council need to have a voice. And I don't think we need to take a straw poll on that. Sam, would we need to do that? Okay.
No. Just
So,
speak what you think you heard. Yeah.
perfect. Yeah, I agree with the rest of council with the idea that council need to have a voice. And I think it goes back to what Mary said, because I believe Rachel's concerns are valid. But I think with Mary's idea of having 2 council members involved, I think that might be a good idea. Adam mentioned that final approval through call-ups as well, call-up base. And those are some of the alternatives. From what I hear from Mark Wallach and Sam, Mark mentioned 9 was too much or too many people. And I agree, it's a lot of people to manage, or a lot of people within the process. And that's something to look into. And Bob mentioned you need more than 11 people to have some alternative candidates just to ensure the process so that, if people drop out. Is there anything that I'm missing out of this? I know Mary mentioned fleshing out the critical incident and what it means. And I think the restorative justice is something that most council members agree to or voice are in favor of. The name enhancement, I agree with Mary with the name. I think that's a great idea. And I don't think there is any other feedback unless, Mark, do you have a question, Mark, or you have any feedback?
Not a question, just a short comment. I also want to support Mary's suggestion. When we appoint people to boards and commissions, we select them. I don't think anybody has a lot of appetite for rejecting people. It's a very public process. And I think 2 members of council on the selection team could flag issues before they arise and put us in the difficult position of saying that we're actually going to reject a particular individual. It's a little awkward for us. It's certainly awkward for them. And to the extent that we can avoid it by having a little early input by a couple of council members, I think that would be beneficial for all parties. Thanks.
Thank you. Mary, you have a comment?
Yeah, I just wanted to thank the task force and staff that your dedication to this has been so exemplary, and your product is so impressive. And you've given a lot of time, and it's really, really appreciated. And I hope that you continue on, some of you, and thank you very much. This has been hard work, and I appreciate that.
Aaron, you have a final comment?
Yeah, well, I'll echo what Mary just said. Absolutely, thank you for all of your work. And I guess it sounds like a lot of where council is maybe disagreeing a little bit or having different thoughts is about how the appointments get made, and that is a tricky question, right? So I guess we'll see what you all recommend based on our discussion. I probably would not go to having council members on the appointment committee. Actually, I felt like that worked out pretty well, honestly, when Mary and I did it for getting this started. But that was a sort of extraordinary one-time experience, and this is going to be a year-by-year thing. And it's often the case that committee members tend to be deferential to city council members, and so I feel like the council members might have a little more influence, and it might be good to leave it more in the hands of the other committee members and the nonprofit. So I'd probably lean more towards that approach.
Thank you, Aaron, for your comment. We have our mayor.
Yeah, I just wanted to come back to what Aaron just said, and I kind of agree with that. I mean, there's pros and cons to having council members on these kind of committees, and in this case, perhaps it would be best not. I'm still focused on the public input component of this. So if the one thing, Adam, that I wasn't so in favor of a call-up mode for is because it wouldn't have the public input at a public hearing, because I think what's really important here, especially for the first one, right, is we're establishing this, and I think we need to hear the feedback, and we need to be real deliberate about hearing the feedback. It could be really easy, it could be all positive, or there could be issues that the public will flag for us that we may not be able to get. So regardless, I just advice to the implementation team, regardless of what your final recommendation is, my suggestion is that you think deeply about how we would take public input and how council is involved with that.
Thank you, Sam. Michelle has a comment she would like to make before we're done with this section. Go ahead, Michelle.
Thank you again, everyone. I don't want to be labor, but I just want to respond to the renaming. Not necessarily that I'm opposed. I definitely think all suggestions are worth considering, and we'll bring it to the group. But the first thing that came up for me was that that's also part of the name of the activation we're talking about, and community members is the same for the word officer as overseer. So I'm not sure if any of you are familiar with that history, but it might be worth a quick read. And then just thank you all for your input. We've definitely considered restorative justice and thought that for the timelines requested, that it would be a lot to really draw out in detail what that would look like. And because restorative justice practices are fluid and constantly growing and changing, that while we do want to include that, it may not be necessary to legislate at this point. So thank you again. I don't want to keep you here later than you need to be, but I do appreciate you all, and I hope you have a wonderful evening.
Thank you for your comment, Michelle. If there is no more comments from our council members, we will move to the next presentation.
I'm sorry, just very quickly, I just wanted to say thank you to all the council members for engaging in this process and identifying areas that you needed further clarification on. All of those were, very reasonable concerns, and we'll take that back to the team, come back with some good recommendations for you all. And thank you again. Really appreciate your time and input on this. Really appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Joey, for your presentation. And we pass the baton to Jane for the next presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Junie. And our next presentation will be made by Kurt Fernhaber, the Director of Housing and Human Services, on severe weather shelter for this upcoming winter season. Kurt?
Good evening, Councilman Joseph and others. I assume you don't want to take a break and we want to keep going. Just want to confirm that. Okay, good. So I'm going to give a very brief introductory statement before we start the presentation to help frame the conversation and why we're here this evening. So if we go back 5 or so years, the programs that we were running in the city, and when I say we, it's a number of partners, it's not necessarily the city. It was really focused on sheltering and emergency services, which is what we're discussing tonight. The Boulder shelter was open only during the winter, wasn't open year round. There was 2 shelter locations, and as some community members have mentioned this week, there was upwards of 400 beds that grew from about 200 to 400 over time. During that time, in the last couple of years, there was upwards of over 2,000 individual nights that were turnaways from shelter. And so that created a lot of challenges for our community. Also, my Department of Housing and Human Services at that time wasn't putting a dime into housing individuals who were homeless. None of our resources were going there. And the number of individuals that were being housed each year, you could probably count on one or two hands. Then some things started to change. Bridge House opened their program, their Ready to Work program. That started off as a great success, and it's continued to really have a ongoing sustainable approach to getting people housed. The shelter then opened up Lee Hill, and those were some of the first permanent supportive housing vouchers in a dedicated site like that. And then City Council adopted a homeless strategy about 3 years ago. And that's when our focus really changed to a housing first focus. We started investing a lot of money in housing and housing vouchers, units. This year, we've already housed or helped 174 individuals exit homelessness. One of the criticisms we often receive is that we're focused on permanent supportive housing. And yes, we are, but that accounts for about half of those who are exiting homelessness. We also have individuals exiting homelessness through our diversion navigation programs. And it's a tapestry of partners. It's the Bridge House Ready to Work program, as well as a master lease program that we started with them last year that helps their graduates get into market housing after they've gone through their program. It's mental health partners. It's substance abuse programs that individuals get referred into. And it's the housing outreach team, the HOT team, it's the court navigators. And every homeless individual who touches any of our programs will be exposed to opportunities that are offered to them to help them exit homelessness. So, however, so I also wanted to mention an email that came in this afternoon from Emily Trosi. I hope I'm saying her last name correctly. And at the end of that article, or end of that email, she had an article from The Guardian about how Finland has addressed their homeless issues. And Finland had lots of shelters throughout the country. They took one of the first homeless first approaches, and they essentially shut down their shelters and really focused on getting individuals into housing. And they've had a lot of success with that. The difference between Boulder and Finland, well, there's many differences, but one is that they're a country and we're a city. And while we're making great approaches and innovations as a city and even a county, we don't have a national strategy. We don't have a state strategy where every community has the type of focus that we have in Boulder. So tonight, we're not going to be talking about Housing First, but Housing First interfaces very directly with the question tonight. And in July, we presented the Severe Weather Shelter Plan to Council. At the end of that discussion, Council asked us to come back with an approach for additional severe weather shelter nights on particularly cold nights. So we are going to focus our presentation on answering that question. And we will also bring in a couple of other items that you didn't ask for that we believe also relate to concerns that you brought up earlier. So with that, I will introduce Vicki Ebner, who you know is the Homeless Policy Manager, and she will be guiding us through this next piece. Thank you.
Thank you. Council, I'm very happy to be here to discuss this very important topic. If you could switch to the next slide, please. So we wanted to focus on 3 questions and really gather council's input on our overall severe weather plan, our proposed overflow plan, and the criteria that we've set aside for the severe weather shelter usage. Next slide, please. I thought it would be helpful here to start with a couple of definitions. The severe weather shelter thresholds that we're currently using and have been in place for at least 2 years are the ones at the top. So these are all predicated on National Weather Service forecasts with certain warnings and watches of everything from extreme cold to heavy snow, or temperatures of 32 or below Fahrenheit if it's dry, or 38 below Fahrenheit or below if there's a likelihood of precipitation. As Kurt mentioned at the City Council meeting in July, we were asked to come back with a plan for how we would address overflow on significant nights. So we define those significant nights as critical weather conditions. And that would be with a temperature below 10 degrees Fahrenheit or below, and or there are 6 inches or more of snow. This is also aligned with what the Boulder Shelter for the Homeless currently uses for their daytime triggers. So if the weather's particularly bad, they will keep the building open all day if the weather during the day meets those criteria. And that has been an established practice for a significant amount of time. And it also ties back with some analysis we've done of the last 6 years of weather patterns. And that correlates to basically the 30 coldest nights of the year, or 12% of the nights that we would be open for severe weather shelter. And those 30 nights had a average low of 9.3 degrees, and the majority of them did include some sort of snow event. Next slide, please. So this is the plan that we are working to go forward with. The first line in orange is our standard severe weather shelter. This uses up to 140 beds at Boulder Shelter for the Homeless. On the shoulder parts of the season, so October 1st through November 30th and March 16th through the end of May, the shelter beds would be used for year-round programming, and then would be the unused program beds would be allocated for severe weather shelter when those traditional weather shelter, severe weather shelter conditions are met. Between December 1st and the middle of March, we would be open every night for uses, including severe weather sheltering. In addition to the severe weather shelter, last spring up until approximately middle of June, and going forward in the fall, we were able to place 20 people in a local hotel who were considered to be at risk for COVID-19. We do plan to make that go forward for this fall. So that's the gray bar that is on this chart. In addition, we know that there will be usage of the CRC, or the COVID Recovery Center. We expect this usage to go up as the winter progresses. This includes serving our populations in an effort to keep the whole homeless system and all of our people experiencing homelessness safe and healthy. And so we expect it to peak around 15 beds. We think that's aligned with when we hit some peaks in the spring. And this is going to allow us to serve people who are symptomatic of COVID-19 or have tested positive. And one other thing to note is that symptoms of COVID-19 also mirror flu, and we expect that flu cases will be up also in the fall. In addition to those resources, we are looking at an expansion plan that would include making an additional 20 hotel rooms available on those critical weather condition nights. And then in addition to that, we are looking at extended day hours. So morning services at Boulder Shelter for the Homeless are currently being offered. This is early morning where they can come in and get showers and food. This would still occur up until December 1st. So tying with where we're opening the shelter every night, we would also extend our day hours to 11:30 a.m. Just like in previous seasons and more particularly when we were dealing with COVID last spring, even when Bridge House was open during the day, they were not open the entire day. We do need a certain amount of hours where we are closed. We can give the facilities a thorough cleaning, and we can keep it from being a 24/7 congregate situation, which is not conducive to public health. Next slide, please. So when we were looking at the plan, one of the things that we did want to do is look at how many beds we would be offering for total sheltering, including both year-round programming and severe weather shelter. So this can range between 140 beds. Well, I'm sorry, the capacity at Boulder Shelter for the Homeless starting in October is going to be 140 beds. You may be aware that they can hold up to 160 beds. But in walkthroughs with Boulder County Public Health, they've been asked to reduce the number of beds so that they can more adequately space people in a congregate situation. With reflecting the different items that I touched on the last slide, you can see that that's going to make our available beds range from 165 beds up to 195 beds on really cold, critical nights. Our standard program still provides between 145 and 175 beds. Next slide, please. So one of the things that we thought was important to show is our forecasting on what that would look like and how we came up to what beds specifically for severe weather shelter would provide us. And so this chart reflects not only our estimates for our year-round programming, including both navigation and housing-focused shelter, the number of people we're expecting to be utilizing the COVID Recovery Center and our hotels. That still allows for between 30 and 63 beds on any given night that could be used for severe weather shelter. And then, of course, on those critical weather condition nights, it would go up an additional 20 units. So, you know, one of the things that is really important to us is that we're building a system in which we're using shelters as a tool in order to engage people through our different housing, diversion, and reunification programs. And so this shows that we are trying to level and really work through the different bed configurations. Next slide, please. So one thing that Kurt mentioned at the start was that we do provide different types of services to help people exit homelessness, and that we had actually exited 174 people between January and July. This just gives you an example of the different factors and the different functions. I will say that the first few months of COVID response, housing people, particularly with permanent supportive housing conditions, was a tough thing, and our agencies really stepped up to the mark, and you can see that our trend really didn't lose a lot of steam. And so we're really proud of those exits, and we think that that also has an impact on what bed space has been made available at Boulder Shelter for the Homeless. Next slide, please. So I know that this is a topic that comes up quite frequently, and that is how we use the facility. So this reflects the navigation program, average nightly census per month for the past 2 years. The navigation program was provided at Bridge House prior to this June, at which point it was taken over by Boulder Shelter for the Homeless. But this gives you an idea of where we believe not only where we have been on our census, but also where we expect to go from September through next May. A couple other tools that are out there. I would be remiss if I didn't mention that the municipal court was just awarded a grant, which will help us bridge people who are close to being housed, who are also high utilizers. So that will take off some of the stress on shelters and persons experiencing unsheltered homelessness. So that is a really exciting piece of news. And again, I would say that we couldn't have gotten to these levels at the shelter without some really concerted effort from both Boulder Shelter for the Homeless and Bridge House in providing those exits. We are also working with the county and our partners to look at different housing options that may be needed, as we have some concerns about people entering into new homelessness as a result of the economic conditions caused by COVID. Next slide, please. So one of the other things I wanted to, this is one of our extras, that we wanted to let everybody know that the county is establishing a dedicated team that will be providing testing and vaccines on a regular basis for our unhoused population. This will begin in mid-October. They will be doing asymptomatic testing. And in addition, they will be providing flu vaccine clinics. Both of these things will be offered not only in our shelter systems, but also in places that are frequented by unsheltered persons. Next slide, please. So returning to the questions, does council have any input on severe weather shelter plan, our overflow plan, or our criteria for severe weather shelter stays? One thing I will note before the discussion starts is I did not mention that there is a requirement that we're setting up this year for severe weather shelter entry to require a coordinated entry screening process to happen to be able to use the severe weather shelter. As with all of our other programs, any person that has not yet been able to go through CE will be provided a grace night and will be asked to go through coordinated entry the next morning. And for those of you who may not know exactly what coordinated entry is, it is our front door to our single adult homeless program. And that provides us the opportunity to screen people to figure out what their particular needs are and where their best program alignment is. And also allows us to provide diversion services for people who could possibly be diverted from the shelter system and long-term homelessness. And with that, that concludes my presentation. Be happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you, Vicki. Does council have any questions? Our first speaker is Rachel.
Thanks, Junie, and thanks, Vicki and Kurt, for the presentation. There were a couple things that were confusing to me, so I wanted to clarify the critical weather conditions versus severe weather shelter. I found just new terminology, I guess, so I wanted to clarify what the critical weather conditions apply to. Is the 32 and 38 degree threshold still relevant to any of our services? So that's kind of question one. What's severe weather shelter versus critical?
So can I just jump in for a second? And before I answer that, I also wanted to mention to council members that Greg Harms of the Boulder Shelter is on this call as well, and he can answer questions that you also may have. Vicki, do you want to answer that, or you want me to go for that, or?
Sure. The short answer is yes, they are still relevant. The 32 and 38 are what we're calling our established or standard severe weather shelter criteria. The critical weather conditions are those estimated 30 coldest nights of the year. So that's 10 degrees or below and or 6 inches of snow.
So it doesn't necessarily impact, what it impacts is the capacity, and the capacity would increase on those nights.
Okay, so in terms of like when day shelters open and when severe weather shelters open, those are not necessarily tethered to the critical weather conditions, other
Correct.
than we may get some extra beds on the nights that those kick in. Is that accurate?
And there is a time period between December 1st and March 15th where severe weather shelters opened every night, regardless of temperature.
Yeah, and
Thank you. And then, so right, there's no triggers for the middle months, but then on months on either side, there are weather triggers, which are still 32 and 38.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. I think I'm hearing Aaron maybe want to colloquy.
Well, just to clarify, right? So I think you just summarized it well, but is it the critical weather events that triggered the all-day shelter? And is that?
It triggers the all-day, it triggers when the shelter would be open all day. It also triggers the additional 20 hotel rooms that would be added.
Right. So those additional rooms are only available on the critical weather thresholds. And that's also when you get the all-day daytime shelter. And both of those things would be true throughout the entire sheltering season. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. But then it's in that December 1st to March 15th, that the basic number of beds is available every night. And then the rest of the sheltering season is with the 32, 38 threshold.
And Aaron, the reason we decided to go in that direction of opening every night is because in reality, it's open like 85% of those nights anyways. From a planning perspective, as well as just simplicity and understanding it for the clients who would use the system, it seemed to make sense.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And just while you're talking about it, thanks for doing that. And I think, council did express a desire to do that back last in the late winter as well. So thanks for being responsive. All right, sorry, Rachel.
It's okay. I have a couple more questions. So wanted to clarify I'm sorry I can't pull up the presentation, so I wasn't able to go back and confirm. But in terms of the number of beds last year versus this year, can you just really cleanly lay out, here's the max beds we had in the 2019 season, and here's our max beds for this season, as well as how many of those are unrelated to COVID? Like if you took the COVID beds out because somebody doesn't have COVID, what are the numbers of beds available now versus last year, shelter beds?
So I think last year, Vicki, if I'm correct, we had 282 beds. This year it's about 195. If you take out the CRC, that goes down to 180. However, it's also worth noting that the CRC has worked very well as a place of respite. You'll know that actually the majority of individuals that have stayed at the CRC are actually not COVID positive. We've had even individuals this summer who have come out of a surgery or some sort of medical condition, and they've stayed at the CRC for their recovery. Those are actual individuals in our community that if the CRC was not there, they would actually be going to the shelter to stay there.
Thanks for that clarification. And I do appreciate that feature of the CRC. It seems like a really good community benefit. Okay, so then my next question, the next question is kind of a larger and maybe trying to understand philosophically. So it sounds like formerly severe weather shelter did not require coordinated entry program commitments, right? Like you could just show up and get a bed without any ties to coordinated entry. Do I have that accurate?
Yes.
I think I've seen Kurt nod. And now we have it that you can have one night without coordinated entry, and that's it for the season without using coordinated entry for severe weather shelter. Is that accurate?
That's correct.
Does everybody qualify for coordinated entry? I know there's a 6-month window for some things. I just want to figure out by adding in coordinated entry requirements, just to make it very transparent and clear, what does that mean for people who want shelter from the cold on a cold night? Assuming that they want to go through coordinated entry, is anybody ineligible for the second night or the 10th night?
Yeah, one of the things I think it gets misconstrued in the community is what CE is. It is a screening process. So you are either screened to a diversion program, navigation, or housing focused shelter. We're not requiring for use of severe weather sheltering, we're not proposing to require that you have to be engaged with those programs. We're merely asking that you go through that screening process. And the idea behind that is to hopefully and ultimately get somebody into one of those programs and engaged.
So is anybody, after they go through coordinated entry, not going to be eligible to stay in the severe weather shelter, like because of time in the community, or I don't know, they did it 3 months ago and they're not eligible again today to go through coordinated entry? Are there any blocks by saying we're going to require coordinated entry?
No, because once you've gone through coordinated entry screening, you've gone through it. And so you have, for lack of a better word, credit for going through it. For those of, I think you're getting at the people that maybe aren't meeting our 6-month criteria. Those are people that, well, not all diversion clients are people that have been here less than 30 days. I'm sorry, less than 6 months. All people who have been here less than 6 months do qualify for diversion. So they would still be allowed to stay at severe weather shelter. It's not a barrier.
Okay. And just to make sure I followed the other point you made, if somebody went through coordinated entry in like right now, and then they come for severe weather shelter in 2 months, even though they maybe didn't pick up any services, they can still stay at the shelter because they did the screen within ever or within a couple months, or are there
Yeah, there's no time limit on
expiration dates?
Yeah, we don't actually expire those dates. What we do is if somebody has been in the community for over 2 years and there's some reason why we need to change where they were screened to, we can reassess them. But it's hard to use 1920 severe weather shelter data because of COVID. It skewed a lot of our thinking and a lot of our data. But if you look at the 1819 numbers, over 85% of the people who actually used our severe weather shelter at 30th Street had been through coordinated entry. And it broke out about half and half of people who were sent to or referred to housing focused shelter or navigation services, because at the time we didn't have diversion services. But it did break out half and half, and it was the vast majority of people that were using the service. The only caveat I would give with you is that back then we didn't have the 6-month requirement. So I think you would see a different mix of people going forward, but it would be everybody, but the majority of the people that use the shelter would have been through it.
Okay, so if I'm following you correctly, somebody can just go through coordinated entry, the screen, and there's no required follow-up or rules that they have to follow, or a prescribed program that they need to be compliant with to stay nights 2 through 30 in the shelter. Is that accurate?
That is true. Of course, we would prefer that people do engage with our services so that we can help them in their homelessness. However, it is not a requirement. The only requirements, and Greg may be able to talk to this a little bit better, they do have to, of course, comply with shelter rules, but no, it wouldn't impact anything else.
And are the shelter rules, thank you for that clarification, are the shelter rules different than they were at Bridge House when we had severe weather shelter over on 30th?
Bridge House had rules that were related to for the safety of the residents and the staff. And they're very similar to what Boulder Shelter for the Homeless provides. Boulder Shelter has a little bit more structured plan on how they actually do any kind of response. And I would defer to Greg on those questions.
So Rachel, can I add one more thing, one more important point? It was actually on one of the slides of the presentation, but we didn't speak about it. So another of the recommendations is that those that go through severe weather shelter would have 30 days of severe weather shelter through the season. So again, that's encouraging them to get into services. What we found in looking at the severe weather shelter data over the last couple of years is that the median individual who goes to severe weather shelter stays there about 3.5 or 4 nights in a season. However, there are individuals that stay much longer than that, who are part of our community and use severe weather shelter, as their shelter on a more ongoing basis.
Okay. Thanks for that clarification. Just in terms of the different rules, possibly, it seemed like there were different times that people could arrive for the shelter versus Bridge House. Is severe weather shelter allow you still to arrive later currently?
That's correct. However, I think it might be helpful for Greg to answer that question. We don't want to speak for the shelter on their rules.
Is Greg here?
Yes. He just needs to unmute himself.
Yeah, this is Greg.
Greg.
Boulder Shelter for the Homeless. Our normal curfew times would apply for all of our programs this winter. So that means check-in time is from 5 to 7 p.m.
Okay, and at Bridge House, what time, how late could people arrive? Does anybody? I'm just wondering what the change might be and if it's.
They used to not have a curfew, but in the last year they did establish a curfew. I believe it was originally 9 o'clock and then it moved up to 8 as we started working on the transport between Bridge House and the CRC and Boulder Shelter. So they did bump it up. Traditionally, they also found that by about 7:30, they were fully booked anyway. So there are of course the rare occasions where the police officers might bring somebody, but generally for getting people voluntarily coming up, they're going to deal with it earlier in the evening.
If I could also add, there's an important component this year that we haven't had in previous years, which we started this spring in the middle of March, and that's to look at each individual as they go into every shelter and screen them for COVID symptoms. And if we leave that open from 5 o'clock to 10 o'clock, it's very difficult to run that process over 5 hours. So having a defined time worked for the shelter last year, and it also worked for 30th Street at the time that COVID became a challenge in our community.
Thanks for that clarification too. I'm almost out of questions here, Junie, so I promise it won't be too much longer. For the daytime opening for the shelter at 10 degrees, that just seems a little, well, it seems very cold to me, given that a lot of the library spaces aren't still open. Was there any thought given to the reduction in daytime spots around the community due to COVID and how we're counterbalancing that?
So I think the daytime services were put in place to respond to the lack of public facilities. The shelter normally didn't have daytime services. And Greg may want to speak to this, but they were looking at how that could be structured within their staff, as well as having a few hours to be able to clean the facility. At 30th Street this spring, they opened in the middle of the day for, I think it was 3 or 4 hours. And then it had to be cleaned afterwards. The shelter is recommending that it would be cleaned once a day. And that's why it's structured that way. But I'll just hand it over to Greg to see if he has any additional input on that.
Thanks, Kurt. Just to be clear, what we proposed is being open. Normally, we would close at 8 a.m. And what we're proposing is being open till 11:30 a.m. During the severe weather shelter season, which is the December 1st through March 15th time period. In addition to that, we would be open all day when those really critical weather conditions are met, the 10 degrees or 6 inches of snow. So both of those things would be in place for the season.
Thanks, Greg. I guess I'll save most of it for discussion, but it would seem to me that 10 degrees is pretty cold for critical, and I would think that there are health hazards at a higher temperature. So maybe, and I understand you said that 10 degrees is the long-standing day shelter opening threshold, but again, given that a lot of the places that people might go ordinarily are not available now, is there room, or was there discussion about raising that temperature threshold higher?
And if I could maybe clarify, the core time period that Greg is talking about between December 1st and March 15th, those would be open every day regardless of temperature until 11:30. So it doesn't have to hit 10 degrees to be open.
Thank you. And I did understand that. I guess I'm just thinking if it's 12 degrees and I have to leave, I don't know where I would go. And I would think that's a low temperature to be out in the cold. So I'm just trying to figure out where people will go and if that's the right temperature. But again, I'll save that for discussion. I think that's all I have for now. I really appreciate your responses.
Thank you, Rachel. Adam, you're next.
Thank you, Junie. I had a couple of clarification questions as well. First of all, on the first slide, you have the 38 degrees plus precipitation. What is the actual chance of precipitation that triggers that requirement? So is it 30, 40, 50?
It's 30.
30, okay. Thank you for that. And my other is, I don't know if this is going to be for Greg or not, but there are still obviously people who cannot be sheltered in severe weather shelter, people with pets, I believe. I don't know if people who are a couple that want to be sheltered in the same place, if that's still against the rules, but there are those groups that regardless of them being in coordinated entry or not, they could not access severe weather shelter, correct?
Yeah, there are always people that we can't serve for a number of different reasons. Some people who don't want shelter, some people who can't stay in the shelter for a myriad of different reasons. Two of them that you just highlighted. One, people with pets. Of course, we permit service animals, but not pets. And we do serve married couples or couples, but of course, they have to stay in separate dormitories.
Gotcha. I just wanted to make sure I understood that while we're discussing later on. Those are my two main questions. Thanks, Rachel. You asked a lot of what I want to ask too, so appreciate that.
Thank you, Adam. Aaron, you're up.
Thanks. Thanks for the presentation and the information, folks. And Rachel covered almost everything I would have asked, but I got a couple last ones for you. I think you mentioned a grant, which sounded intriguing. Could you tell us a little bit more about what that's going to fund and how that's going to help us out?
So, can I interrupt there for a second, Vicki? So Judge Cook and I actually had a conversation about this today. And she would prefer to give the information and details on that grant. While we know those details, it was written by the court navigators, and I prefer that she give the information on that because that's what she requested.
I always like to have something to look forward to, so I'll take that. Okay, so I guess my other question, so we had been, I had raised the issue about what overflow would look like during this sheltering season, right? And so it's, as I understand it, the answer to what overflow looks like as proposed is that on the critical weather nights, we will have 20 additional beds available in hotel rooms for, I guess, individuals who've been around a little bit longer who would then make space at the shelter for 20 additional people. So is that a fair summary?
I believe so, yes.
And what do we do if there's, if it's like that, not a critical weather night, it's 12 degrees and not 10, or it's just a regular cold night and we get more people who are looking for severe weather shelter than we have beds for?
So I've got a couple things that I'll mention around that. First of all, that situation can happen no matter what our triggers are.
Sure.
And how many beds we have. There's always that risk of turnaways. So, and I've mentioned this many times before, but the communication for a lot of individuals who are homeless, who travel, it's important for them to know what the capacity of the community is for us to hopefully prevent that. When there was a number of, when there was almost a third more beds or twice as many beds a few years ago, that was a real challenge. The thing I will mention, and if you could remember back to March and April, when about every 2 weeks we were giving an update to council on things that we were changing or implementing or expanding because of COVID. I hope we don't have to do that every 2 weeks during the season, but we will certainly be monitoring how this is working. And we won't be waiting to schedule a time with council, probably to discuss something if there's clearly challenges that need to be addressed. But we would also look forward to giving you updates as IPs or whatever on a regular basis, or in alignment with your regular COVID updates that you'll probably be receiving through the season.
Yeah, and updates would be important, but Kurt, I don't think you answered the question though about like, when if we get more people, if we get 3 more people than those, 140 beds, do we have any options?
Well, first of all, it's 160 beds. We will always have, well, for the main part of the season, well, even for the majority of the season, we have 160 beds, not including the CRC.
Okay, thanks for the correction, but the question still stands.
Yeah, sure. Greg can maybe give a little more history here about this, how the seasons normally play out. But normally in October, there will be a couple days or a day of turnaways, which it's important for that to happen before it gets too cold. We probably would have some flexibility to increase over those 20 beds in the situation that you've defined. However, in not defining the number of beds, you also end up with the situation of expanding the turnaways.
Sorry, I didn't follow that last statement.
Yeah, so if you always provide a bed for everyone who comes every night and you keep expanding in that way, it does increase the number of individuals until you get to a point where you can't expand anymore, which is what happened a few years ago, and then you have a huge number of turnaways.
Okay. All right. Well, thanks. That's it for my questions. If we can discuss a little bit more when we get to discussion.
Thank you, Aaron. Mark?
Thank you. Thank you, Kurt. Thank you, Vicky. Great presentation. Just a couple of quick questions. How do our weather triggers compare to those of other cities, Longmont, Fort Collins, or Denver, in terms of accessing severe weather shelter or critical weather shelter?
So I'm going to hand this over to Vicky, but before I do, I'll just say that Longmont doesn't have severe weather shelter. Many communities don't, particularly if they're a housing first approach. But we did that. I don't have it in front of me now, but we did that research, I think last year. At that time, the city of Boulder's weather triggers were at least 10 to 15 degrees higher than other communities that have weather triggers. But Vicki, do you know what the triggers are in Denver right now? Or
and one caveat I would give is that every neighboring community is going through some sort of reassessment of what they're providing for severe weather shelter in a COVID environment. But my understanding is that Denver has probably the most generous number. They use 40, but they don't have their beds to population demand is significantly lower than ours. However, if you look at Adams County, Jeffco, Broomfield, they use 20 degrees or 32 if it's raining or snowing.
My next question is just, I'm curious, what tends to be the resistance factor with respect to people who don't want to participate in coordinated entry? Since it gets you 30 days of shelter, why is there resistance, and who generally is resistant to doing that?
So there are a number of reasons why people may be resistant. Some of it is mental illness, and there's a distrust of systems, and there's sometimes a fear factor of being in a congregate setting. There are cases where, as Councilmember Swetlick mentioned, that they maybe have something that precludes their use of sheltering ongoing, so something like a pet. So there really isn't any difference between severe weather shelter and CE as opposed to year-round programming and CE. The barriers are pretty much the same.
Okay. And my last question is, how quickly can you be responsive to an extreme weather event if the need were there to go beyond the 195 beds that are presently the maximum, and you saw a weather system coming in and it was just going to be so brutal that you needed to make a quick accommodation? How quickly could you turn that around, and what would that look like?
So we've had lots of practice of that this year and this past spring.
Sure.
So, I would say our nonprofits, and particularly our partner with Boulder Shelter for the Homeless, are very reactive. It's a matter of staffing and bringing in additional staff as needed, because even if we place people in hotels, we do have to have people that are checking on them and making sure that everything is working for them. It also is a factor of, on those expansion nights, how many hotel rooms are available at the hotel. So Boulder Shelter does talk to some of the other area hotels to see if we have some backup options. If it were to get extremely bad, where there was a talk of needing to open a secondary facility, that gets a little bit more problematic. That takes a little bit more response time in order to get all the things that go into it. We set up the CRC in 4 days, but generally expanding to open, we can do within a number of hours.
So Mark, could I just add one more thing as well? So we could add a few hotel rooms, with relatively short notice. However, a different facility is, that's a huge lift. And first of all, there's very few facilities in our city where you can actually sleep individuals because it requires fire sprinklers. We were able to move quickly on the CRC because the East Boulder Community Center actually is sprinkled. But there's not finding a facility and opening it in hours or even days is very difficult.
Understood. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Mark. Sam? You're muted.
Twice tonight. So I just have one question. On slide 8, you have the census comparison, and starting September, you have an estimated, and it looks like the estimated number of folks in housing-focused shelter is expected to go up by 20 or 30 or so. Why is that? What happens at that point to raise the number of people?
Well, during that time of the year, we often see a trend in that direction. But what we did for our estimate is we also took that trend and we added 5% to it to be conservative. But during the winter season, those numbers typically go up.
Okay, I guess I can see it in 19. I didn't see it before then. So, okay, thank you.
Thank you, Sam. Rachel?
Thanks. Just a couple of follow-up questions. So finances wise, if we reduced capacity by 100 beds roughly, do we have a cost savings from that, or where did the money go? And obviously putting the COVID beds, the CRC aside, because I assume that's being paid out of COVID specific funding or hopefully getting reimbursed for that. How did that impact our budget?
So we increased our funding into housing this year. If you remember, part of the approach was to continuously work at getting individuals housed out of the shelter to make room to accommodate the severe weather shelter. So those resources, I mean, 30th Street was relatively expensive because we were renting a building and it was a whole nother set of staff required to work a 24/7 approach. So those savings went into additional vouchers to get additional individuals into housing this year.
So we increased the number of people going into housing as a result of reducing. Was it like a 1-for-1? Like, are there 100 extra people housed as a result of that?
It's not a 1-to-1. I believe it's about 2 or slightly more, 2 to 3 people that you need to house to get a sort of a permanent 1-person reduction at the shelter. I think it's about 2, but we would have to come back with you on that exact number, but it's in that ballpark.
Okay, thanks. And then just something that you mentioned about communications just raised a couple more questions for me. So one is, what is the communication strategy facing out towards people who will need severe weather sheltering? A couple weeks ago where we hit the cold snap, or however long ago that was, there was some question about like, these are, it's new information going out, and do we have it on our website, and what time is it getting there? So I'm just wondering if there are updates on sort of how we are going to get information to people who may need it.
So I'll let Greg respond to that one.
We'll be using very similar approaches to what we've done in the past. In the past, some of that was done by Bridge House, and we will have to pick up that mantle for that communication. We will make the call 24 hours in advance when we're in the weather triggered season, but unlike last year, we'll be open every night for SWS from December 1st through March 15th. So the actual need for communications during that time period will be significantly less. There'll be far less uncertainty for our clients. They'll just know for sure that we're open every night. So hopefully it will actually be a much easier task than last year.
Yeah. Thanks for that, Greg. And will the city's website include that information at all? Like we have a severe weather shelter page. Will we also get it up ideally 24 hours in advance?
It will, but I don't think people actually use that website for that information. So the shelter has a website, but predominantly people hear about it through the services. First of all, when they leave that day, they already know if it's going to be open or not because that announcement has already been made. But also programs like Community Table and Harvest of Hope, our HOT team, the Be There team, all of those individuals or programs would be a place for communication as well, which is also something that happened last year.
And thanks for that. So like during the last cold snap, some people reached out to me and didn't know where to look for the information, and also said it was, didn't want to trek all the way north to find out that the shelter was at capacity. So will there also be information, at 5, 6, and 7 o'clock, maybe updating the numbers that are available so that people know whether it's worth their while to enter the lottery or try and get a bed?
I'll let Greg answer that.
Thanks.
We have not done that in the past, and I don't anticipate that we would. It's very difficult to do because we can have 20 or 30 people show up at a 6:45. So that's just really challenging, and I'm afraid that we would mislead more people than we would help if we tried to do that.
Helpful last spring to get information on whether we had reached capacity, and I would think as well as we're going into this new sort of hotel voucher system and all the different, COVID CRC beds and COVID related and hotel level 1 and then the extra level 2 triggers. Could we get those updates again so that we know, and if we have to rethink or make decisions, we can do it more in real time?
Yes, we can certainly do that.
Awesome. Thank you. That's all. Those are all my follow-up questions.
Thank you, Rachel. Bob, you're up.
I just have one question. It's really a follow-up to questions that Aaron and Mark asked. If we were just a couple, 2, 3 beds short on a particular night, do we have kind of a mutual aid agreement or just an understanding with some of the other shelters? Like, for example, in Longmont, do we, as a matter of practice, if we're a couple of beds short, do we call up there and say, hey guys, we've got a few extra guys here. Can we take them up there for the night if you guys got some extra beds? Does that happen?
So as Kurt mentioned, the Longmont doesn't actually run a severe weather shelter.
Oh, I realize that, but they have beds though, right?
Right, but they do something called emergency shelter on cold nights. So they're basically using all of their beds anyway. So on a situation where we would be approaching an overflow situation, they probably are too. But we have in the past, matter of fact, last spring, we set up a program where we moved people between Bridge House and BSH to better utilize beds. So if that is the will of the council, we can certainly talk to some of the other counties and see. We've had similar conversations with some of our partner counties, and I will stress that transportation becomes a problem. If you're talking about an extremely bad weather situation, getting people up the highway and placed other places gets very dangerous.
Okay, thanks.
Are there any other questions? I see your hands is still up, Sam. No? Okay, thank you. I did have a follow-up question to Rachel's question earlier about impact of the severe weather shelter on coordinated entry. And I was a bit concerned as well with the fact that it might impact it. So I would like to know if maybe, Kurt, if you would be able to keep stats on that information just for the severe weather shelter.
So you would be asking for some sort of information on how many people declined to go through coordinated entry.
Or who declined its service because of going through that process.
I think we could probably see a way to do that. Yes.
Thank you. And I think I just wanted to follow up with, I think part of the question, it was asked by Mark and Rachel, and to me, it wasn't clear enough for me. I was just wondering, is there a penalty? For instance, let's say I come to the severe weather shelter and you wanted me to go to coordinated entry, and I said, no, I just want a bed to lay my head. What happened? Do you get turned away, or what if that happened on the second day?
You don't get turned away. What you will be told though is that if you want to stay additional nights, you'll be required to go through coordinated entry, and coordinated entry will be available for you the next day. You don't actually have to do it that evening.
So the next day, if you don't do it, you can't really stay at the severe weather shelter, basically.
That's correct. The other thing that I'll note is we're opening a office downtown the very beginning of November at 9th and Arapahoe, and it will be an office in the downtown area for coordinated entry. So it will be another point for individuals to go through coordinated entry, as well as diversion services. That will be run all day, Monday through Friday. And if you went through coordinated entry that afternoon and went to the shelter would know that you had gone through coordinated entry.
Okay. Thank you. And I think I just wanted to follow up with the 10 degrees, 12 degrees threshold. And it just dawned on me that we've been talking about homeless services, since I've been on council, which has been 10 months. But I think part of the discussion is that, with people not having access to shelter unless it's 10 or 12 or 10 degrees, is day services. Are there day programs for, let's say someone cannot stay at the shelter because it's not below 12, but let's say it's 15 or 20. Are there places, homeless people can go, or people who are in homeless situation, they can go to just, spend the time until the time to go back to the shelter and sleep?
So basically from 12 o'clock to 5 o'clock, we wouldn't have that facility open. Or to 11:30 to 5 o'clock, we wouldn't have that open.
So there's no programming basically from any nonprofit or other organization, do you know, or no?
Vicki, do you want to respond to that?
Not as such. I believe community table starts a little bit earlier at like 4:30, but they are not, the last time, and this could have changed, but the last time they communicated to us, they were not planning on having day services.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I have a quick question, if I may colloquy or just follow up on this. What about Harvest of Hope? I thought they were open during the day.
They are, yes.
They are. And the reality of shelter life is you leave the shelter, you head back downtown, you get your lunch at Harvest of Hope, you head back to get in, queue up for the night service with some activities that happen in the, other things that you want to do during the day. But typically people who are utilizing our shelters do have sort of patterns of behavior, and they have figured out ways to make things work. Harvest of Hope, as with everything else, is very limited in the amount of time you can be in there. So it's really more of a picking up food and leaving.
Okay, well, thank you so much. Do you have any other questions, Mary, or anyone else has any other questions? Okay, well, since no one else has any other questions, we can move on to the comments section, which is talking about input, the plan for the severe weather shelter, and 2 on the overflow plan, and 3 input on the severe weather shelter state criteria. So who wants to kickstart? Rachel, you're first.
Well, I haven't been too quiet, so I'll go ahead and kick us off. I'm pretty concerned about the day shelter situation, given that the libraries are closed, and my understanding is that's a natural fit for a lot of people, given that we don't have day services. So I don't know what the solution is, but that just seems too cold. And I would like us to talk about having day shelter somewhere be available. I don't know what the right threshold is, but 10 degrees doesn't seem right. So that's one just thing I hope we'll talk about. It seems that if we are requiring coordinated entry screens to stay at severe weather shelter, that's a change that should be intentional. So I would think that council should dialogue about that and talk through what the benefits are, and also consider whether that would maybe make more sense to do not in 2020, which is already such a difficult year. So it's an extra hurdle, it seems like, and I just wonder, does that need to be done, and especially this year? And then how did we get to the cap at 30 nights? Does that make sense to council? And the fact that we have reduced available beds by 100, it seems less like a significant number to me. So that also seems like it should be intentional. And so I just want to flag that as hopefully things that we will talk through tonight. I think that I don't tend to be in the majority of council on this subject, so I'm not sure it's that important to say what I would like to see happen. But I think that the 30-night cap, the switch to coordinated entry, the reduction by 100 should all be really intentional by this council, and should be talked through. And I will say, I think for the 10-degree threshold, that doesn't seem right. So that's my kickoff. Thanks.
Thank you, Rachel.
Can I just give one clarification to Rachel? The 30 days is not a cap. It's when we look back over the last 6 years, it's been about 30 days per season.
So I must have misunderstood that. So maybe just a follow-up. So could somebody stay in?
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm getting the 30 days mixed up. I thought you were talking about the critical weather nights. You were okay.
Like you can only stay at severe weather shelter for 30 days in a season, right?
That's correct.
That's your cap. Yeah. So that's what I again, just think we should be discussing and intentional. Thanks.
Yep. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel. Bob?
Colloquy with Rachel for a second.
Please.
Actually, Rachel, I would be most interested in hearing what you would like to see happen. We're always looking for solutions, and I would like to know.
Agreed.
So, thanks, Mark, for your interest. I would say that I would not have coordinated entry be a requirement. Maybe consider it in a future year, but especially while we're dealing with COVID and just a lot of the upheavals of 2020, and we know that it is an extra burden for some people. I would just probably not ratchet that up this year. So I would, and I understand that Kurt and Vicky have good reasons for wanting to connect people with services, and that is our housing first model, and it makes sense. Still wouldn't do it this year. And in terms of the reduced capacity by 100, that's part of why I asked about the budget. Like, do we have some extra money, or is there some finagling we can do? Because that just seems like a sharp reduction, and what we've seen around town this year doesn't lead me to believe that we're going to have just a precious few people seeking shelter on cold nights. I think we're going to my prediction is that we will be turning people away and reaching capacity. And I would like for us to have a more robust plan and fewer, if any, beds lost when we were already turning people away last year with an extra 100 beds. In terms of the 30-day cap, I feel like I need more information on that. Like, how did we arrive at that number? Is that a rational way to approach this? And then to Adam's point about, like, there are people who just can't stay at shelter. I think that gets to some of the other issues that we've been struggling, including safe parking and right to rest, and what do people do on those cold nights, and how do we treat people with dignity and compassion, especially when it's lethally cold out. So thanks for asking.
I appreciate it.
Thank you, Rachel. Bob?
Yeah, a few things. First, I'll make a broad statement. I endorse the staff's recommendations and the approach the staff has taken, so I appreciate that. And I would not propose any changes to what staff is recommending. With respect to coordinated entry, and specifically, we have experimented with that. We tried last spring to take all comers without requiring coordinated entry, and it was a mess because if you don't have to go through coordinated entry, you won't. And if you don't go through coordinated entry, we can't give you stable housing. So I think that is not, coordinated entry is just a registration. That's all it is. It takes a few moments. It doesn't require you to do anything other than give your name and your background. And so I think coordinated entry after that first night is an appropriate thing, and lets us get folks teed up for what we really want, which is a stable and permanent housing. We've experimented with a lot of things over the years. We had BOHO for a while. That ended up actually hurting more people than it helped, or at least hurt a lot of people. We tried some experiments recently about taking off the weather triggers, and that ended up being a bit of a mess as well. So I think we've kind of wandered through the wilderness here, and I think the staff has arrived at a good, solid place. We've also looked at best practices in other cities and are applying those. And I would also finally observe that our temperature thresholds, or at least the ones that staff presented to us last spring, sounds like Vicki indicated that there's maybe some adjustments going on. I'd be interested to see where those heading, but at least as of last spring, Boulder was significantly higher than most of our peer cities that had temperatures significantly lower than our thresholds. And of course, when that happens, people tend to migrate to Boulder because if we're the only place open, they'll come here, and we mathematically, we can't take all comers. And so we have to have some sort of guardrails on what it is that we'll do. I would have 3 requests of staff, however. While I endorse the staff recommendations, I do have 3 requests. Number one, I'd like to see some periodic reporting. I'll leave that up to Kurt and Vicki as to what that looks like, whether that's on a weekly basis or bi-weekly basis, but relatively frequently. It'd be nice to have just a quick IP, maybe it's just a paragraph or 2. We get a West Nile report in the summertime that comes on a weekly basis, but just something from staff or from the shelter that indicates some of the things we talked about tonight, as far as how many people do we serve, how many beds were extra, do we have to turn anybody away. I think one of the council members asked for some information on how many people declined to participate in coordinated entry after that first night. So whatever information you think would be helpful to us, I think it would be nice to have a periodic report during the course of the winter so we can kind of track trends and see how things are going. Second, along those lines, I'd welcome an opportunity to have Kurt and Vicki come back I'll call it the early part of the winter. I don't know if that's the last meeting in December or one of the first meetings in January, but before we get too deep into the winter, perhaps CAC could schedule an update of this meeting, 30 or 45 minutes to hear how things are going in the first few weeks of the winter. And then we can decide at that point if we need a midwinter update as well. And then finally, I think it'd be helpful. I don't know what this looks like. I'm just going to throw it out there. It would be nice if we could have a little bit of optionality. I think the numbers you've pegged based on our past experience feel right to me, but we don't know, right? And to Aaron's point, it'd be a real tragedy if we came up 3 short on a particular night. And so I don't know if that looks like mutual aid with Longmont, or whether that's some extra hotel rooms that are kind of on super standby. Obviously, if we have 50 or 100 people show up more than the beds that we have, then we have a completely different problem we have to address. But if we're just a couple, 2, 3 beds short on a particular night, I'd hope that we would find a place, whether it's squeezing people in or opening up a rec center or having a hotel on double standby or something like that, just so we have a little bit of a safety valve if there's just a couple, 2, 3 people that are without housing on a particularly cold night. So those are my 3 recommendations. But I think generally speaking, this is a good plan, and I'd like to check in very frequently to make sure it's working.
Thank you, Bob. Aaron?
Yeah, so I'll echo some of Rachel's concerns here that we are looking at many fewer beds this year, and I appreciate the overflow option with the hotel rooms, but I'm concerned that we're going to fall a fair amount short on the need that exists kind of within our own community. So, last year we had the Path to Home facility as well as the Boulder shelter. And obviously there was more beds, but it also provided for backup and reinforcement options. And I thought everybody did a fantastic job, the shelter and Bridge House and the city, in kind of being able to move folks around to make sure that we had a little additional capacity on the toughest nights. So I'm really concerned that we've lost that ability. And, like Bob was talking about with, if we're falling a little bit short, right? If we find out that, hey, we've almost got it right in terms of the need in the community and what we're providing, but we're consistently 3 or 5 or 8 beds short. I really don't want to see those folks turned out into the cold kind of night after night after night. So I get that, we can't serve 800 additional people, our resources are finite, but I just really hope that we could have, well, not just hope, I would very much want us to see, some flexibility, some backup options so that we can deal with, small or moderate additional needs. I do, like Rachel said, I'm concerned about the day options as well, because of we don't have the public spaces available in the same way. So I appreciate that the shelter is planning on being open during the day some days. That's great. It hasn't generally been the practice, so thank you for that flexibility. But the threshold is at such a low temperature, and if that it's not open, I don't know what other options people are going to have on those coldest of days. So I don't know if we can change that threshold or have some other option available during these extraordinary times when the usual resources aren't available. And just in terms of coordinated entry, I'll say it does make sense to me to have coordinated entry be involved here, because that's how we connect people to services. And it is a fairly doable thing to go through coordinated entry. I think that one night free is important. So when people show up, they get a night, doesn't matter. But the next day, I think it's pretty doable to get to the coordinated entry facility. So I'm fine with that. I'm concerned about the overflow needs and about the day needs during these times. So appreciate the thought and care that you put into this plan for sure. So thanks very much for that and for all that you all do. But that's where I'm seeing issues from my perspective.
Thank you, Aaron. Adam?
Thanks, Junie. Yeah, I'll start pretty broadly. This conversation is always a really tough one to have. And I understand this is not a criticism at all of our city's work, but to have a lottery system, it feels very Hunger Games-y to me. You're essentially choosing who gets to survive any given night. That's pretty crazy that we have to live in a world like that. And I hope that both our state and our national government will step up at some point so we can actually address these problems at their core. Again, not a criticism of you guys. It's a tough conversation. And when we're looking specifically at this, I do share a lot of the concerns that Rachel and Aaron have put out there. I did really like Bob's idea. I think we've all come to the conclusion that this is a regional issue. So if we can coordinate regional beds in any way possible, I understand that's very difficult on a severe weather night. But that brought me to the idea of, hey, if we rent a school bus and it has a heater in it, the chances of someone surviving staying in a school bus with a heater are a lot higher than if they're out in the cold. So even if we had the transportation system, that itself is maybe more survivable than nothing at all. I'm not going to try to go and nitpick too much what's already been said, but surviving just over 10 degrees, even during the day, I think is a difficult task. And also, I think Bob made a few good points about what type of data we should see on a regular basis. And something that I think is important is we started getting turnaway data on a regular basis. Thank you, Kurt and Vicky, for getting that upon request last year. I still think that's an important piece, just so we can recognize what turnaway rate we have. And also, I think it's kind of important that we know what the amount of deaths from hypothermia and cases of frostbite we have on a consistent basis are, because those are measurements and they're horrible things we have to measure, but I think it's our responsibility as the leaders of this community to know exactly what's happening, and even if it's terrible. So those would be my requests. Thank you.
Thank you, Adam. Sam?
Yeah, and thank you to staff, as always, for the hard work on this. I have to comment at how much more sophisticated and layered this approach is today than it was when I got on council in 2013, when pretty much everything was done by lottery. So there were no housing-focused shelter beds, there was no navigation, there was no set aside for the CRC, and we didn't have hotel beds. And so this is a very, very different plan, and staff has got a lot of nuance in the thinking about how the housing-focused shelter approach interacts with severe weather shelters. So I appreciate the deep thought that staff has put into this, and also the coordination with the county effort. So generally, just to answer the questions, I think this is a good place to start. It's never going to be good enough. So one of the things about this conversation that I think everyone has to realize is, I'm going to quote Greg Harms, probably not exactly here, but we cannot solve regional and national problems with limited local resources. So we always have to try and make it better, but there will always probably be people who are falling through the cracks. So we should try and seal the cracks up. But we have to not let the perfect be the enemy of the good, in the sense that we have to serve as many people as we can with the resources we have, and we have to do it as effectively as we can. And towards that end, I will say that the coordinated entry has been a huge advance for us, because we can answer the questions like Adam just put out. In the past, it was very hard for us to know who came to access services when it was just a lottery. It was guesswork and who you saw the most often. So I think this is a good start. I have to agree with Aaron and Bob in the sense that we need to have a little elasticity when we have, on the coldest of nights, on the critical nights, is when we need the most elasticity, I think. Input on the overflow plan, it's a start. It's good. It has both the CRC and the hotel beds involved, and I think that is positive. And it's different than what we've had before, when the overflow plan was kind of ad hoc, and it became Boho often was the place of choice for folks to go. They didn't have to go all the way north, and there were no rules necessarily, or at least a smaller set of rules. And so the other piece, of course, about coordinated entry is it does direct people to services. And the goal here, of course, is to keep people from suffering in severe weather, but that's not an ultimate solution. That's what you do for the night and the day when it's super cold and people are in need of shelter, but the long-term solutions have to look to, what's the long-term problem. And so, yes, we need to shelter folks, but I really do think that the long-term shelter is where we have to concentrate on this. Input on the criteria for severe weather shelter stays. I think it's interesting this year that we have a difference between severe weather shelter, which we used to be weather triggered, and now that those triggers are it's open all winter mostly. And then we have this additional critical weather. So that's a new trigger, and it expands the system, which is when it most needs to be expanded. So I think the staff plan is a really good start. As far as the 30-day limit and all of that goes, the number's never going to be perfect until we have an infinite number of beds, and we're not going to have an infinite number of beds anytime soon. So I think it's important for us to realize that one thing that has happened over the last 4 years is the number of people who were going through coordinated entry in 2017, about 21% of them had been here for less than 6 months, and about 41% had been here less than 6 years. And now in 2020, 61% of the people going through coordinated entry have been here for less than 6 months, and almost 70% have been here for less than 1 year. So when we have to make tough decisions about who to serve with limited resources, I think we want to start with the people who have spent the most time here and who have the most attachment to our community. Those are the ones that we need to focus on first. And Adam, I'll come to your point about the lottery. I've been against lottery systems for as long as I've been on council. And this lottery is very different than the lottery that was in place when it was 2013, because we are actually using a method to prioritize the most vulnerable, because people have these housing focused beds, and those are people who have gone through coordinated entry and who are trying to get into housing. And then we have people who are going through navigation services. And I think Greg could speak to some of the policies at the shelter that focus on the most vulnerable first. But this lottery system is now the last thing being used for the walk-up, as opposed to the only thing being used. So I think this is a very, very good start from staff. I look forward to thinking about how we can bulk up everything else. But I will also say that in the past, there were no day services. There was nothing to offer. Bridge House was one of the first organizations that offered day services. That's how they got started, and their foothold here in Boulder was the Carriage House. So the situation is better than it's been. We do have less beds than we did last year, and there is COVID, and both of those are areas of concern. So one of my thoughts to one of Bob's suggestions, which I thought was good about getting periodic updates, is we could create a dashboard that we could look at our will. I mean, it's nice to get IPs, but those often go by pretty quickly. The dashboard that we have up now is how I got the numbers about how long people have been here. And so an idea might be, if you're going to collect the data that council's asking for, you may put it in an IP, but I think having it on a dashboard would be great, because then rather than you having to do an IP every 2 weeks or 4 weeks and get it to us, if the dashboard was updated once a week, we could go check ourselves. And then I agree with the idea of having you come back in the last meeting in December so we can check in on how things have gone. And if things aren't going well, we can schedule another one in February or something like that. So, not to say we're there yet, but I do just want to emphasize this is the most sophisticated approach that we've had so far as I can tell. And we need to keep our eye on it, but we've added services and we've added pathways out of homelessness that haven't ever been here before. So I want to thank staff for all the work that you do on this. You don't get thanked enough. You get criticized quite a bit. And I think you probably knew that when you stepped into these positions, but it doesn't make it any easier. So I appreciate your hard work. And This problem is one that we wrestle with every single year, and through the winter, we typically wrestle with it 2 or 3 times. So I just want to appreciate everybody who's continually trying to make it better. That's all, Junie. Thanks.
Thank you, Sam.
Do you mind if I colloquy on Sam?
Please.
I agree actually with Sam. I think the dashboard is fantastic, and it's been a great tool that we've had it up for 3 years now. It's a place I go to all the time for information, and I point community members to that as well. My only criticism of the dashboard is information is often stale. Right now, the most current information you get is the end of August. And for a while there, we were actually several months behind. I suspect that had to do with staffing and just availability of people to input that data. But I agree with Sam, rather than having you guys have to write a weekly or periodic IP, if you could just update that dashboard once a week, that would be great. That's all the information we could possibly need. So if you want to use that tool rather than writing a separate memo, as long as we can keep it up to date, that would be preferable.
Can I just give an input, Junie, to that? So we had one of our data, our department had 2 data folks working for us. One was on furlough, the other was working on other things within our department. We were actually down to 0 data individuals for about a month and a half. We've just hired a new data individual, and they started, I think, 2 weeks ago. And that's actually why it's updated to August. Otherwise, we wouldn't be there. So I'm very thankful for that. But that certainly will be a priority. And we have confidence that we'll be able to do a better job in keeping that up to date.
Great, thanks, Kurt. It's a great tool.
Junie, can I colloquy as well into Sam's points?
Please.
May I, or Sam? Just the first on the day sheltering, and that this is an improvement because we didn't used to have it. I would just sort of gently counter that. I think the reality is that we have had it sort of de facto at the libraries and that they're largely closed. And so I think this year is a step down in terms of day services, because when it's really cold out and the libraries are not open or have significantly reduced capacity, people won't have a place to go. So that's a big issue I see for day services. That's I understand not everybody's seeing it the same way, but I would ask that maybe staff and Greg at least look at it through that lens and see if there's more that's needed. And then second, on staff's on Sam's point of appreciating staff, I just wanted to echo that and say that I also appreciate all the work that you do, and think that we all have our heart in the right place, and we're all trying to make this a better situation for the people that we're trying to help and serve. And I think sometimes we or the community sort of make things personal and maybe don't trust each other's intentions. And so I realize it is a hard job, and that you are all acting from a place of wanting to help. So I appreciate it. Thanks.
And Rachel, if I could colloquy on your colloquy, and thank you for that. One of the things that we have done successfully in the past has used members, organizations of our faith community to help us out. And to the day services point, we do need to clean the spaces where people stay in the evening. It might be an interesting thing to approach some of the folks in the faith community, because they've reached out to me in the past saying, what can we do to help? How can we make this situation better? And in this year, they may be even more inspired to do that than usual. So it might be worth reaching out to some of the organizations who used to support BOHO and who have expressed interest in being helpful, and see if we can use them for day shelter. Because I do agree with Rachel's gentle reminder that the libraries are often a de facto day shelter, and they're essentially not available this winter. So it might be a time when we can call on some of our other partners to help out. Thank you, Rachel.
Thank you. Is there Mary? You're next.
So thank you everyone for your comments, and especially staff for all your hard work. One of the things, Sam mentioned how different things are from 2014 when we first started down this path. And one of the things that Sam didn't mention was that at that point in time, we weren't housing people. And now there's a lot of people that are housed. And I think that's a real important point. This afternoon, Greg Harms and I exchanged some emails back and forth regarding the lottery system. And I was trying to understand it. And I think that the slide, that's the census slide that has the blue and the orange. If you could bring it back up. I think that answers some of the questions, because in the conversation the email conversation that Greg and I had, he was saying, I expressed the same concerns that others have with the lottery. And I think the reason that Greg is confident that the lottery won't even be necessary is because of this graph here. And the way I'm reading this is that the navigation went down because, well, both the navigation and the housing focused shelter have gone down. And so that provides a little more space in other places. And is that a correct assumption? Could somebody
The other thing that I would add, Mary, is that all the individuals who are part of that graph will not go through that lottery system. It's only people that would be above that graph.
Okay.
Which is severe weather shelter folks.
All right. So I think that this is the graph that tells us that provides some level of confidence that the lottery will not be used very little, if at all.
That's correct. It would only be used on those nights where they think they're going to reach capacity. So it's for those individuals on those handful of nights.
Okay. So that's one point that I wanted to make. I also, with respect to the day shelter, I like the idea of reaching out to the faith community and seeing if they can provide that gap sheltering between 11:30 and 5 p.m. There's also potentially another place that's much closer by, and I'm wondering if that might be available, which is, doesn't Lee Hill have a fairly big kind of community room? And I'm just wondering if that's not something that could be used for those 5 hours on those days that it is 10 degrees or below, or some cold weather trigger, because I do think that there is a gap there, that from 11:30 to 5, there is definitely a gap that needs to be addressed. And then I agree with the points made regarding the 2 to 3, the elasticity, as Sam referred to it. I also agree with Bob's requests, and then the idea about the dashboard. I think that's a perfect solution, especially now if you have a data person. And then with respect to the coordinated entry is what we can attribute all of our housing successes to. Without that, people wouldn't be getting permanently housed, and ultimately that's the solution that we're looking for. The 30 days is a rational conclusion based on the fact that most people, and I forgot the percentage, most people stay 3 to 4 nights, if that. And so there's very few people that even stay the 30 days. So I think that is based on data and past experience. I think that is all I have. And I agree with coming back sometime before we get too late into the winter to just a quick update. And in lieu of coming to council every other week, the dashboard will suffice. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. Our next speaker is Rachel.
Yeah, my hand must still be up. I'm sure you've all heard enough from me tonight, but I don't have anything else.
Thank you. Mark, you're up.
Yes, very briefly. I thought the program put forth by staff is excellent. I think it's nuanced. I think it's addressing the problem as best that we can. I agree with Sam's comment. We will never have the resources to solve a national problem at the local level, but we have to do the best that we can do. I do share a little bit of Aaron and Rachel's concerns about the temperature trigger for the critical weather standards. And I would have no objection if you wanted to look at that again and perhaps nudge it a bit higher. But other than that, I think it's a good plan. I agree with the concept of outreach to our faith community to see if they can provide some additional resources, particularly for day shelter. And I agree with most of Mary's comments as well. So not to belabor it, those are my comments.
Thank you, Mark. And thank you all for this lively discussion. Just a quick recap is, I do agree at first, I did agree with Rachel with this idea of, I was concerned about the coordinated entry through the severe weather shelter, but after hearing from Aaron and how it's just a vehicle to get people housed and it's not a heavy lift, I think I agree with it as well. If, the idea is to get people housed, I think that's heading in the right direction. But I'm still very much concerned about the day service issue. I've been concerned about that since I got on council, and I'm still very much concerned about it. And I think it goes back to what Aaron mentioned. It's either the threshold is too low at this moment. It's either we raise it or we find services for people. And I think this idea of outreach to the faith community is a great way to look into closing that gap. And then now we're moving to Bob's suggestions, which is the periodic reporting. But I think we decided that the dashboard would be better to track trends. And he mentions CAC update in the first week of the winter. And also, if once for critical weather services time, if there are a few people that are being turned away, whether we can have either the rec center or hotels available for people. And that's basically what sums up our discussion. Unless someone think there's anything that's missing, please chime in. If not, I think I'll just thank Kurt for his presentation. Is anyone have any question or comments? No? Okay, perfect. Well, I would like to
Junie, I'll make a comment. You did a very nice job tonight. Thank you very much.
Definitely. Nice job.
Awesome job.
Well, thank you so much. I would like to thank the monitor and the task force or Housing and Human Services Director and all involved for the great work that they've done. And to my fellow council members, I hope you have a wonderful evening, and this meeting is adjourned. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Junie. Night, everyone.
Right. And Greg, thanks for being here. Right, good night.
Take advantage of it to fill the vacancy.